Hello, my dear friends. They swallowed vinegar mixed with their own urine to stay pure, scrubbed their tongues with ash, and wrapped their chests in cloth so tight they could barely breathe. Behind silk veils and candlelight, hygiene became a quiet war against the body itself. Each tool, each ritual, was both devotion and punishment, beauty and torment. Tonight, you'll step into their world, where cleanliness was faith, pain was pride, and purity demanded a price you'll never forget. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Consider turning on a fan for a soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to enter a small medieval village at dawn, the smell of smoke and damp wood would fill the air long before the market opened. Inside the dim cottages, women began their morning rituals quietly. Before tending to animals or kneading bread, they turned to the simplest form of self-care they knew, cleaning their teeth. There were no glass mirrors, no porcelain basins, no polished brushes. What they had were tools shaped by survival and custom. A pig's bristle, singed slightly in the fire to make it stiff, was tied to a small stick or simply held between fingers. It served as their toothbrush, rough and primitive, yet believed to bring cleanliness and respectability. To a medieval woman, maintaining her teeth was a duty, not a luxury. White teeth signified health and purity, even if the methods to achieve it were far from gentle. In homes made of wood and stone, women often crouched near the hearth where light and warmth met. They mixed ashes from last night's fire with coarse salt, creating a grey powder with a sharp, mineral scent. The mixture scraped more than it cleaned, but that harshness was mistaken for effectiveness. As they rubbed the bristles dipped in ash and salt across their teeth, they winced from the sting. The sound was faint but steady, like sand against pottery. It is both amusing and unsettling that what they considered freshness was, in truth, the taste of smoke and burnt salt lingering on the tongue. Water was precious and often unclean. So many avoided using it entirely. Some women tore pieces of dry cloth from worn garments, dipped them in vinegar, and wiped their teeth carefully, believing the sourness removed rot. The smell was sharp and stayed long after. The sensation of vinegar on the gums brought a false sense of health, a reminder that in an age without knowledge of bacteria, pain itself was seen as proof that something worked. Mothers taught their daughters the same methods, passing down the idea that cleanliness required endurance. To endure pain was to be proper. The idea of cleanliness was deeply tied to appearance. Men and priests judged women by their faces, by how pure they seemed, and the teeth were part of that judgment. Rot or stains were not merely ugly, they were moral failings. The irony is that their efforts to appear pure often led to injury. Salt burned their gums raw. Ash left small cuts where enamel had worn thin. In the absence of understanding, damage was invisible. The habit continued because it was tradition, and tradition was rarely questioned. Most women made their own brushes, sharing them with family or neighbours. Hygiene, as we define it now, did not exist in the same sense. A single bristle brush could pass between several mouths before it was discarded. Between uses, it was left on windowsills or hung near the fire to dry, collecting dust and insects. Still, these small acts made women feel dignified. In a world where control was rare, cleaning one's teeth became a private act of order. If we compare this to today, it would be like using burnt wood and coarse salt instead of toothpaste, believing the burn meant purity and the pain meant progress. The taste of metal and smoke mixed with the morning air. Behind each ritual was hope to remain presentable in a world where illness and poverty shadowed every household. The act was repetitive, mechanical, yet strangely intimate. These moments were often the only time a woman was alone. To clean her teeth with what little she had was a small rebellion against decay, even if it brought harm instead of health. It was an illusion of control, and illusions were powerful enough to endure centuries. The market sold sticks and bristles labelled as purifiers, though they were nothing more than pig remains and fire ash. Tradesmen boasted about the strength of their bristles, claiming they came from noble animals, while women believed those words with the same faith they gave to prayer. The image of purity mattered more than the reality of infection. The medieval obsession with appearing clean often led to acts that quietly worsened the body. I find it quietly tragic how the pursuit of respectability could drive women to scrape their mouths with tools meant for beasts, calling it beauty. The repetition of this daily act formed a rhythm in their lives. Morning after morning, they dipped the same brushes into the same ash, watched the same grey residue fall on the floor, and felt the same sting in their gums. They rarely questioned why, and even if they did, there were no alternatives. The word disease was rarely linked to hygiene, and pain was simply part of living. What mattered was how one appeared before others, how one kept face in a world where reputation was fragile and gossip spread like fire. In some households, tooth cleaning was a shared ritual. Women gathered near the hearth, talking softly while scrubbing. A faint bitterness of salt filled the air. The children mimicked their mothers, learning early that discomfort was a sign of discipline. These small moments, repeated across countless homes, created a shared illusion of health. It was a performance of cleanliness, one that soothed the mind if not the body. The illusion was strong enough that even infections were blamed on other causes: bad spirits, poor diet, or the will of God. The story of the pig bristle toothbrush reveals more than just a habit. It reflects how little people understood about the link between cleanliness and health, and how strongly they clung to whatever gave them a sense of control. The crude tools, the burning salt, the dry vinegar cloth, all were symbols of a desperate wish to remain pure in a world that was anything but. They carried faith in every painful stroke, unaware that the damage was slow, silent, and entirely man-made. The act of scraping one's teeth with ash each morning shows the paradox of medieval hygiene. It was an attempt at cleanliness that caused harm, a ritual of comfort that slowly destroyed the mouth. Yet for those women, it was one of the few forms of care they could afford. What mattered most was the feeling of having done something, of being clean, even when they weren't. The story of those bristles and ashes reveals how beauty and suffering often walked together in the medieval world. The belief in purity came with pain, and pain was worn with pride. Somewhere in that faint taste of vinegar and salt, one can still sense their quiet struggle to remain human amid dirt and disease. The rituals of cleaning teeth were only one part of a much larger struggle for cleanliness. As the day went on, other tools would emerge from baskets and chests, some made of metal, others carved from bone. Each carried its own strange story, born from the same mix of need and ignorance. Among them was one object that shimmered with danger, a small blade that promised beauty, but demanded blood in return. In the quiet corners of medieval homes, small tools made of bronze rested beside combs and wooden mirrors. Among them was a blade that shimmered softly in the morning light, its edge dulled by use, but still capable of cutting the fine hairs that grew where they were not wanted. The bronze razor was not a luxury of the rich alone, though its presence often carried an air of nobility. It was considered a symbol of refinement, a small sign that one had the time and patience to care for their body. Women treated it as both a necessity and a risk, for the blade was as unpredictable as the hands that held it. The edge of the bronze dulls quickly, forcing its owner to press harder against the skin. Each stroke left a faint red mark, and sometimes a line of blood followed. Yet that sting was accepted, even welcomed, as proof that the ritual was complete. It is oddly amusing that a tool meant to bring beauty often leaves faces scratched and arms spotted with irritation. The women used these razors to shave not only under their arms, but also their upper lips and brows, where even the smallest hair was seen as a mark of untidiness. The idea of smoothness was linked to purity, and purity was the measure of worth. The ritual took place in silence, often before anyone else had woken. A woman would sit near a bowl of cloudy water, the blade resting on a strip of cloth. There were no soaps, no oils, only a damp cloth to soften the skin. The sound of metal against flesh was soft but sharp, a rhythm repeated across countless mornings. The bronze, warmed by the hand, glided unevenly across the skin. When it caught, the pain was quick, but rarely enough to stop them. Cleanliness demanded sacrifice. In wealthier homes, the razors were decorated with carved handles or etched patterns along the blade. These marks of craftsmanship turned a simple tool into a token of pride. Some were passed down through families used by mothers and daughters alike. There was no thought of hygiene in the modern sense. Sharing was normal. What mattered was not the danger of infection, but the continuity of the ritual. To keep the same blade was to keep the same standard of beauty. For the poor, imitation tools filled the markets. Thin pieces of metal shaped roughly like razors were sold beside combs and needles. They rusted easily, bent under pressure, and often tore the skin instead of shaving it. Still, women bought them because to appear well kept was more than vanity. It was survival. A woman who looked clean had better chances at work, marriage, or simply being left alone. If we compare this to today, it would be like using a kitchen knife to shave, telling ourselves it's elegant because we cannot afford the real thing. The danger did not matter as much as the image it preserved. Bronze razors needed care to last. Some women rubbed them with animal fat or ash to prevent tarnish, believing that this gave them a keener edge. In truth, it dulled them faster. When the blades grew too worn, they were still used, pressed harder and harder against the skin until they cut instead of shaving. The pain became part of the process. A clean wound was preferable to visible hair. That belief held strong, binding generations to a practice that traded comfort for control. Men used similar blades, but for women, the ritual carried a different weight. Female beauty was judged more harshly, and so the act of shaving was done in secret, often without acknowledgement. No one spoke of it, yet everyone understood its necessity. The body had to be managed, hidden, and tamed. The razor was both a tool and a symbol, an object that reinforced the quiet discipline expected of every woman. It is difficult not to feel a quiet sadness for those who learn to mistake small wounds for cleanliness. There was a sense of pride in using something so delicate, even if it caused pain. Some believed that bronze, being a noble metal, held cleansing power. A blade that touched the skin could ward off bad spirits or illnesses. This belief turned the razor into a charm of sorts, both practical and spiritual. It was used carefully, sometimes even blessed before each shave. The combination of superstition and need gave the tool a place in both hygiene and ritual. Over time, families began to engrave their blades, marking them with small flowers, initials, or symbols of faith. These carvings were not only decoration but reminders of care. That beauty, like faith, required attention. When the blade dulled, it was polished rather than replaced. Some women carried their razors wrapped in cloth, keeping them close as personal treasures. For all their danger, the tools gave a sense of control, a small mastery over one's own body in a world where little else could be controlled. Bronze razors were fragile things. They bent, they cracked, and they aged with their owners. Their slow corrosion mirrored the bodies that used them. Still, they remained in use because they represented hope. The hope that appearance could protect, that beauty could elevate one's place in a harsh and unequal world. The gleam of the blade caught the light each morning like a promise, even when it drew blood instead of admiration. The story of the bronze razor reflects the quiet desperation behind medieval cleanliness. The pursuit of beauty was not gentle, and the tools meant for refinement often left harm behind. To women of that time, the cost was acceptable. Pain was not a warning but a companion, proof that they were doing something right. The bronze, once bright and proud, carried the marks of both vanity and endurance. The bronze razor showed how beauty was forged through pain and shared through habit. Each mark left on the skin was a small offering to the idea of purity. In its cold reflection, one could see both discipline and fear, both control and vulnerability. The act of shaving was never just about the body. It was about identity, order, and the endless effort to appear untouched by hardship. The blade that drew blood in the name of beauty told a larger story of how far women went to seem clean. Their bodies bore silent marks of that struggle, hidden beneath layers of cloth and modesty. But while the razor left only small cuts, another tool awaited, one that promised comfort through softness, yet carried dangers that no one dared to question. Hidden in the dim privacy of medieval chambers, women prepared for their most difficult days with tools that seemed gentle but carried quiet dangers. Among the few objects made for their own care was a small, damp piece of sea sponge, soft to the touch. It looked harmless, even comforting, and yet it was used for one of the most personal rituals of all. The sponge, tied with a strip of leather or coarse linen, became their version of a menstrual pad, slipped inside the body and left there for hours. To them, it was a modest solution, born of necessity and silence. Cleanliness during those days was not a topic for open discussion. It was handled in whispers, behind doors that never fully shut. The sponge was first soaked in vinegar, a step believed to cleanse it and protect against disease. Its smell filled the room, sharp and sour, mixed with the earthy scent of wet fabric. Women believed the vinegar's sting meant purity, that the pain it caused was proof of protection. It is both grim and strangely ironic that what was meant to preserve their health often became the very thing that harmed them. The mixture of vinegar and sea matter caused irritation and infection, but such discomfort was accepted as part of womanhood. The body was expected to suffer, and to endure quietly was seen as strength. Once prepared, the sponge was tied to a thin strip of fabric or leather, long enough to remove it later. The design was crude, but practical. There were no shops, no physicians making safer options. Each woman crafted her own, sometimes with help from mothers or older sisters who passed down the knowledge as though it were a family secret. Privacy was survival. To speak openly of the female body was indecent, so their methods remained in the shadows, unchanged for generations. After use, the sponges were not discarded. They were washed with herbal infusions, rosemary, sage, or thyme, and occasionally rinsed with lye water made from ash. The combination was harsh, but it was all they had. The herbs masked the smell, and the ash gave the illusion of sterilization. In truth, it only made the surface cleaner while the rest remained full of bacteria. But they did not know this, and perhaps it was easier not to know. Reuse was not a choice but a necessity. Poverty made waste unthinkable. Women handled the process with care and secrecy. Some hid the sponges in cloth pouches when not in use, tucked away beneath other household tools. They were washed at night, when others slept, and hung discreetly near the hearth to dry. The fire that cooked meals also dried their private burdens, turning the act into part of their daily routine. If we compare this to today, it would be like rinsing a piece of sponge in vinegar and reusing it every month, calling it progress because there is nothing else to buy. The absurdity only becomes clear when distance reveals what was once accepted as normal. The idea of cleanliness was both simple and cruel. To be clean meant to remove smell and visible stains. What could not be seen was not considered dangerous. The hidden infections, the silent fevers, the slow damage. These things went unnoticed or were attributed to divine will. Women prayed for strength more often than they sought treatment. The few who visited healers were given herbs or holy water, never realizing the cause was their own ritual of cleanliness. The sea sponge itself was seen as a gift from nature. Traders sold them in markets as objects of purity, claiming they came from holy waters. Some even blessed them before sale, turning hygiene into superstition. For those who could afford them, the sponges were precious, handled carefully, and reused for years. They symbolized modesty and control, even as they caused harm. The contradiction between faith and reality was hidden beneath silence. The act of preparing the sponge became a quiet ritual of responsibility. It represented discipline, the effort to remain orderly even when the body resisted. The vinegar burned, the leather chafed, but those sensations meant that one was clean, contained, and proper. The ideal woman was not the one who complained, but the one who endured. The pain was a secret they carried, passed down with advice whispered in kitchens and behind curtains. I can almost feel the weight of their silence, how each woman learned that dignity required discomfort and that their pain was to be hidden, never spoken. In wealthier homes, servants might handle the washing, but even then, the task was done discreetly. The materials were the same vinegar, herbs, and because ignorance was shared by all classes. The difference was only in privacy. Noble women suffered in softer rooms, but the pain was identical. The tools, no matter how carefully cleaned, brought the same slow infections, the same quiet fevers that no one dared to connect to their cause. The persistence of these methods showed how limited knowledge was, even in a society obsessed with purity. For centuries, the sponge remained a trusted companion, its risks overlooked in the name of propriety. The belief that it preserved womanhood outweighed any suspicion it might destroy it. Their world was ruled by appearances, and as long as the surface seemed clean, the truth beneath it did not matter. This small, ordinary object reveals how deeply silence shaped the lives of medieval women. It was a time when nature itself was used to hide the realities of the body, when the need to appear pure outweighed the instinct to stay safe. Each sponge held a story of endurance, of care born from ignorance and necessity. It was an invention born not of innovation, but of desperation, and yet it endured for centuries as if it were tradition. The story of the sponge is a reminder that cleanliness and suffering often shared the same hand in history. What was meant to soothe instead burned, and what was meant to protect often destroyed. But even as pain became routine, the search for purity continued. The tools would change shape and purpose, yet the same obsession remained that the body must always be disciplined, no matter the cost. The humble sponge tied with leather showed how far women went to remain unseen in their own suffering. Beneath the quiet rhythm of their days, every act of cleanliness carried risk. The pursuit of purity was never gentle, and soon, another ritual would prove that even the most personal care could become a shared ceremony, one that blurred the line between intimacy and absurdity. In small medieval homes where light barely touched the walls, there existed a ritual that blurred the line between care and discomfort. Women would sit near the hearth, one behind another, holding a small wooden spoon shaped like a narrow scoop. It was carved simply, smooth from years of use, and it served a purpose few today would imagine to clean the ears of someone they loved. There were no mirrors or delicate tools, only patience and closeness. The act was slow, quiet, and strangely intimate, part hygiene, part affection. The sound of scraping echoed faintly in the stillness, followed by the soft breath of relief when it was done. The practice of ear cleaning was not a private act. It was shared between mothers and daughters, sisters and friends. To offer your ear was a sign of trust, and to clean another's was a gesture of care. The wooden spoon, small as it was, carried deep meaning. It could soothe, but it could also hurt if handled carelessly. Women learned to tilt the head just right, to scrape without wounding, to remove the pale wax that had built up with time. It is both tender and absurd that something as simple as earwax became a token of closeness in a world that understood little about hygiene. There were no cotton swabs, no oil, no sterilization. The same spoon might be used for many people in one household. Between uses, it was wiped on a cloth or rinsed in water that was never truly clean. Yet no one thought of it as dangerous. Illness was constant, and few saw a reason to fear something so small. To them, it was a gentle ritual that brought comfort and connection. Women often performed it after long days of work, when silence filled the home. One would sit still while another leaned close, her breath brushing the ear she cleaned. In that moment, the act became less about cleanliness and more about care. Mothers taught their daughters how to carve and use these spoons. The wood was often from willow or birch, chosen because it was soft enough not to splinter. The spoons were smoothed with oil and sometimes decorated with small carvings, flowers, initials, or simple lines that marked ownership. Yet the tools often moved between hands freely. A spoon might pass from one woman to another, part of a bond that went beyond words. Hygiene was not a solitary act, but a shared one, and even the most personal parts of the body could be tended to by someone else. Among younger women, the practice took on a strange and sometimes romantic meaning. There are records of girls keeping small bits of wax taken from their lovers' ears, believing it held a part of their essence. Wrapped in cloth or hidden in small boxes, the earwax became what they called love charms. If we compare this to today, it would be like saving a strand of someone's hair or the scent of their shirt, except it was something far less pleasant. The act sounds grotesque now, but in their world, such gestures felt natural. It was affection expressed through the materials of daily life. In gatherings of women, ear cleaning became almost ceremonial. A mother might clean her daughter's ears before a feast or a holy day, ensuring she appeared neat and proper. Friends did the same before weddings or church visits. The sight of two women sitting close, one leaning over the other, was common in village courtyards. From afar, it looked like whispering, but it was work, slow, careful, and intimate. The trust required for such a task was immense. One wrong move could draw blood, yet the risk was accepted as part of the ritual. I find something hauntingly tender in the image of women offering such quiet care to each other, turning a simple act into a moment of human connection. The wooden spoon was more than a tool, it was a bridge between people. In a time when affection was often restrained, this shared ritual allowed for touch, for nearness, for something wordless yet meaningful. It softened the harshness of daily life, offering a few moments where care replaced labour. The intimacy of it bound families together in quiet ways, and though unsanitary by modern standards, it revealed a kind of compassion rarely spoken of. There were dangers, of course. The spoons were rarely smooth enough, and splinters could cause small wounds that festered unseen. Some women used the tips of knives or pins when no spoon was available, driven by the same desire for cleanliness that shaped so many painful habits of the time. Infection was common, but it was rarely blamed on the act itself. The ear was delicate, but suffering was so ordinary that it hardly drew attention. Cleanliness was measured by what could be seen, not by what might be felt later. The tools themselves were kept among other hygiene objects: combs, razors, bits of cloth, and small treasures of self-care. The wooden spoons, darkened by time and use, carried the fingerprints of generations. When one broke, another was carved. When one was lost, it was remade. The continuity of the ritual mattered more than the quality of the object. It was tradition sustained by habit and love. The story of these small spoons reveals how medieval women found tenderness in the act of maintenance. Their understanding of cleanliness was imperfect, but their desire to care for one another was genuine. What began as a practical habit became a quiet form of connection, one that spoke in gestures rather than words. Through something as mundane as earwax, they found intimacy, order, and comfort. The wooden spoon used for ear cleaning reflected the contradictions of their world: tenderness mixed with danger, affection mingled with ignorance. It was an act that comforted and harmed in equal measure, Yet it persisted because it met a deeper need for closeness. For them, the boundary between care and risk did not matter as much as the feeling of being seen and tended to. The ritual of ear cleaning showed that hygiene was never just about the body. It was about connection, trust, and belonging. In a society that demanded silence from women, these small gestures spoke loudly in their quietness. Beneath the act's simplicity was something profoundly human, the need to care and to be cared for. The wooden spoon, passed from hand to hand, reminds us that intimacy once came disguised as hygiene. It was both practical and emotional, both healing and dangerous. But as the household rituals of care grew more intricate, another tool would emerge, one that looked harmless and ordinary, but held a different kind of threat. A comb made not to adorn, but to hunt what lived beneath the hair. In crowded medieval homes where families shared everything from bread to bedding, the presence of lice was constant and accepted. It was not a sign of shame, but simply part of life. The air carried the faint scent of bodies, wool, and smoke, and within it, the quiet scratching of heads became background noise. To manage what could not be avoided, women relied on a single, trusted tool, a fine-toothed comb carved from animal bone or horn. It was smooth, heavy, and cool to the touch, and it served as both a weapon and a companion in their endless battle against the creatures that lived in their hair. The comb's teeth were carved close together, sharp enough to pull through thick strands and catch what hid between them. Mothers often sat by the firelight, comb in hand, while children knelt in front of them. The sound of the comb passing through hair was steady, rhythmic, and strangely soothing, even as it tugged and stung. Each pass revealed small grey insects that clung stubbornly to the scalp, and each discovery was met with quiet patience. It is oddly touching, and a little grim, that love in those homes often meant sitting still while someone searched your head for parasites. The combs themselves were simple yet sturdy, their beauty found in their purpose. Bone was polished until smooth, horn was bent and filed, and sometimes a few small carvings were added along the edges, patterns of leaves or lines for grip. Though they were made from the remains of animals, they were treated with care, sometimes wrapped in cloth and stored beside jewellery or sewing tools. They were not seen as dirty objects, but as necessities, extensions of the home itself. Hygiene, as primitive as it was, required dedication. After each session, women rinsed the combs in salt water or vinegar. The sharp scent filled the air and burned the fingers. The act of cleaning the comb was as important as using it, though it rarely removed all traces of what had been caught between the teeth. The next day, the ritual began again. The repetition gave life a sense of rhythm work. Eat, clean, sleep, all anchored by small acts of order that made chaos bearable. If we compare this to today, it would be like sitting by a dim light each night, combing through a child's hair with a carved bone comb instead of plastic, believing it to be the height of cleanliness. The thought feels ancient and tender, but also quietly brutal. In households where many generations lived together, the comb passed from hand to hand. Grandmothers cleaned the hair of their daughters, daughters tended to the heads of their children, and even neighbours helped one another. There was no embarrassment in it. To pick through someone's hair was an act of care, and to have your hair tended to meant you were loved. The comb carried the intimacy of family, the patience of time, and the faint sound of scraping that filled long evenings when stories were told and candles burned low. Yet the tool was not without pain. The fine teeth cut into tender scalps, pulling at knots and scraping away skin. Children cried silently while mothers hushed them, urging them to stay still. To be clean meant to endure, and endurance was a virtue. The lice always returned, and so did the comb. It was a cycle that no one could escape, but everyone accepted. Cleanliness was not victory, only a pause between infestations. I can almost feel the weary tenderness in those women's hands, knowing they fought a battle they could never truly win, but still combed as if victory were possible. In richer homes, servants were tasked with the same ritual. They used more ornate combs, sometimes plated with brass or silver, but the purpose remained unchanged. The insects did not respect wealth. Even queens were known to keep fine combs in their chambers, their maids searching their hair with the same careful patience as any peasant mother. The difference lay only in comfort. The setting was softer, the combs smoother, the silence deeper. The bone comb represented both survival and resignation. It was proof of how far women went to preserve order in a world that offered little control. While men fought battles and worked the fields, women waged their own war against the unseen. Their victories were brief, but their persistence was endless. Each stroke of the comb was a small defiance against filth and shame, a quiet act that said, "We still care." Some combs were passed down as heirlooms, their edges worn thin, their teeth uneven. They held the memory of countless hands, countless evenings spent in the same slow rhythm. These objects, though humble, connected generations through care and touch. They embodied the truth that hygiene in the medieval world was rarely about health, it was about dignity. Even in poverty, people sought ways to feel clean, to appear civilized, to maintain a fragment of control in lives filled with hardship. The story of the bone comb reveals a tenderness that hides within struggle. Its purpose was simple, yet it carried meaning beyond cleanliness. It represented patience, care, and the human instinct to restore order where there was none. In every family, the same scene repeated: a woman, a child, a comb, and the faint scratch of survival. The comb made from bone was more than a tool. It was a symbol of endurance and intimacy. In a world that lacked comfort, this act of grooming was one of the few gestures of love that required nothing but time. But as hair was cleaned and stories shared, another ritual awaited, one that demanded the same patience, yet turned its focus from the head to the hands, where beauty and dirt met beneath the nails. Within the quiet rhythm of medieval mornings, after faces were rinsed with cold water and hair tied neatly back, women turned their attention to the smallest and most revealing part of their appearance, their hands. The hands spoke of labour, of class, of the kind of life a woman lived. Dirt beneath the fingernails was not just filth, it was proof of hardship. To remove it was to show refinement. So, among the few personal items they owned, there was a simple tool carved from wood, a flat spoon with a narrow edge used to scrape away the dust that collected under the nails. It fit perfectly in the hand, small and light, yet it left red marks when pressed too hard. They worked patiently, often by a window where light fell softly across their fingers. One hand held the other steady, while the wooden edge slid beneath each nail. The faint rasp of scraping broke the morning silence. It was an act of gentleness that quickly became punishment. The tool cut deep, lifting more than dirt. The sting it left behind was ignored, replaced by pride in its result. It is bitterly humorous that the price of appearing graceful was skin rubbed raw by wood and grit. Poor women made their own tools from scraps, splinters of firewood shaped thin with a knife and polished with ash. They kept them tucked into aprons, ready to use before going to church or the market. This was not vanity, it was discipline. A woman could have calloused hands and torn sleeves, but her nails had to look clean. It meant she had control, even when the rest of life was chaos. To them, cleanliness was not comfort but proof of order, and order was the only luxury they could afford. Among the wealthy, the same act was performed with more beauty than ease. Bronze scrapers replaced wood, their handles curved elegantly, their edges sharper. Some were etched with vines or initials, an attempt to disguise cruelty beneath ornament. They were stored in small boxes near combs and razors, shining faintly in candlelight. Servants used them on their mistresses, kneeling on the floor and catching flakes of dirt on cloth. The ritual was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Refinement was measured by attention to the smallest details. Even the half-moons beneath the nails, the scraper served more than one purpose. When ash or salt for tooth cleaning was scarce, women used the same flat edge to scrape the residue from their teeth. The tool that had touched soil now touched the mouth. No one thought it strange. There was a faith in practicality, a belief that if something worked once, it could work again. If we compare this to today, it would be like cleaning our nails and our teeth with the same dull blade, calling it efficiency because it saves time. To them, it was not foolishness but necessity. The scraper was used every day. After cooking, after tending the fire, after feeding the animals, women reached for it again. Each use left faint scratches that hardened into calluses. The skin around the nails toughened, but clean hands gave pride. Their world demanded purity from those who worked the hardest. Cleanliness meant strength, and strength required pain. In small courtyards, women gathered under the sunlight, their hands busy. Some sewed, some combed hair, and others scraped nails. The light caught the dull sheen of the wooden spoons as they worked, reflecting off the movements of care repeated endlessly. Children watched, learning early that beauty required discomfort. No one questioned why a task meant to keep them clean caused such pain. It was part of being proper, part of being seen as good. Inside grander homes, the same ritual took place behind curtains. Noble women scraped their fingers until they burned, then hid them under gloves. Bronze replaced wood, but the effort remained the same. Pain was not visible beneath silk and lace. The tools may have differed, but the idea was unchanged. A spotless hand was a sign of virtue. I find it quietly tragic that the quest for refinement demanded small wounds to prove worthiness. The wooden and bronze scrapers alike became symbols of restraint. Each mark beneath the nails told a story of control. The act was small, private, and endless. In a world where filth was unavoidable, the illusion of purity was everything. To neglect it was to invite judgment, and judgment in their world could wound deeper than any tool. Over time, the spoons darkened from oil and sweat, their edges smoothed by years of scraping. Some were handed down like modest heirlooms, used by mothers, daughters, and granddaughters alike. The pattern never changed. The same small blade, the same quiet pain, the same belief that to be clean was to be worthy. Even as the tools wore down, the ritual endured. The story of the flat scraper reveals how even the smallest gestures of care carried weight in a world of dirt and hardship. Clean hands became symbols of dignity. The nails, though fragile, bore the burden of respectability. Through scraping and pain, women built a version of beauty the world demanded, one that erased every trace of the labour that kept them alive. The image of a woman sitting by the window, scraping her nails in silence, captures the contradiction of her age. She worked until her hands ached, then punished them to appear untouched by work. That balance between effort and illusion defined her life. The cleaner her hands appeared, the more invisible her suffering became. The flat scraper, whether carved from wood or forged from bronze, showed that even the gentlest rituals of cleanliness carried quiet violence. And when the nails were pale and smooth, attention shifted again to another tool, hidden in clay jars, that promised purity through fragrant water and herbs, but delivered little more than a passing illusion of comfort. Among the quiet tools kept in the corners of medieval homes, there was one small object that few spoke of but nearly every woman owned. It was a ceramic bottle, narrow at the neck and round at the base, often hidden beneath layers of fabric or stored behind jars of herbs. Its purpose was not decoration, nor prayer, but cleansing. Inside, it held water mixed with rosemary or diluted vinegar, believed to purify what could not be mentioned aloud. The small hole at its tip released a thin stream when tilted or squeezed, just enough to rinse but never enough to truly clean. It was the ancestor of what would one day be known as the spray bottle, though to those women it was far more private and delicate. The ritual of using it was performed in silence. After menstruation or whenever discomfort arose, they warmed the liquid slightly and crouched near the hearth or beside a wooden basin. The faint scent of herbs and vinegar filled the air, mingling with smoke and damp wood. The sensation was mild, often disappointing, but it gave the illusion of relief. It is strangely comical that something so awkward and inefficient was once seen as a symbol of purity and health. They believed that the sting of vinegar meant cleanliness, that the burn was proof of effectiveness, even as it caused irritation and pain. The bottles were crafted by local potters. Each was unique, some plain, others decorated with faint lines or patterns of flowers that cracked with age. Wealthier women ordered smoother ones with glazed surfaces and soft colours, while poorer families made do with rougher clay that absorbed the scent of vinegar. But no matter how different they looked, their purpose was the same: to cleanse what was considered shameful to speak of. Their use remained hidden, whispered about, but never named. The small bottle became an emblem of secrecy, a tool that offered dignity through silence. The liquid inside differed from home to home. Most filled it with rosemary or sage water, hoping to drive away infection. Some used vinegar, others added crushed petals or bits of ash. There were no written recipes, only advice passed quietly between women. The knowledge lived in whispers: what worked, what burned, what gave comfort for a day or two. Hygiene was not a science, it was tradition, fragile and inherited. The act itself was slow and imperfect. The hole was too narrow, the stream too weak. They tilted the bottle carefully, waiting as a thin trickle fell against the skin. It barely cleaned, but it created a sense of renewal. The scent of herbs masked what they feared others might notice. To feel rinsed was to feel safe. To feel safe was to appear moral. If we compare this to today, it would be like filling a small perfume bottle with vinegar and misting it over the body, believing each spray could wash away sin. To them, it was not absurd, it was necessary. The bottles broke easily, shattering with a careless touch. When that happened, they wrapped the shards in cloth and threw them away discreetly, unwilling to let others see. Even in homes where privacy was scarce, these moments were fiercely protected. Families who could afford more owned several. Others shared one bottle among sisters or neighbours, rinsing it in the same basin of cold water. Cleanliness was communal, and so was ignorance. The use of herbs and vinegar was not just practical but spiritual. Water itself was sacred, and washing was tied to prayer. They believed that purification of the body could cleanse the soul. The bottles thus became small devotional objects, both useful and symbolic. Pain was accepted as part of penance. The sting of vinegar was interpreted as the body's way of rejecting impurity. Their understanding of cleanliness was closer to faith than to knowledge, and faith demanded endurance. In noble houses and convents, servants prepared these mixtures under strict instruction. They boiled herbs, strained the liquid, and poured it into small jugs before transferring it to the bottles. Sometimes drops of rose oil were added, creating a fragrance that marked status as much as hygiene. The richer the scent, the higher the respect it earned. Cleanliness, once again, became performance. I find it quietly tragic that what began as self-care turned into a ritual of pain and perfection, where even discomfort had to smell sweet. The persistence of these bottles shows the resourcefulness of women in a world that gave them little. They adapted what they had, shaped tools that met their needs, and built rituals from fragments of knowledge. Even when their methods harmed them, the act of maintaining control over their own bodies brought a sense of dignity. Every drop poured from those bottles represented defiance, a refusal to let nature or shame define them. As time passed, the bottles became smoother, the liquids more fragrant, but the silence remained the same. Generations reused the same methods, believing in the same sting, whispering the same advice in the same fearful tones. Cleanliness had turned into faith, one reinforced by centuries of ignorance. They did not wash away impurity, they washed away doubt. The story of those small ceramic bottles captures both ingenuity and misunderstanding, the endless struggle to feel pure and the quiet suffering that came with it. Their fragility mirrored the women who used them, both breakable, both burdened by expectation. The scent of rosemary and vinegar filled their rooms, symbols of virtue in a world that never gave them rest. The image of women crouched near the hearth, bottles in hand, pouring thin streams of scented water over their skin, lingers like a scene of devotion and despair. They sought purity with what little they had, never realizing that their remedy deepened their wounds. It was not foolishness that drove them, but survival cloaked in ritual. And when the bottles were set aside, other inventions waited, stranger, rougher, and born from the same desperate need to remain clean in a world that never truly was. In the poorer corners of medieval villages, where cloth was precious and silence surrounded every subject of the female body, women found desperate ways to manage what they could not control. Each month arrived without mercy, bringing pain, exhaustion, and the fear of stains that could betray their secret. There were no shops, no linen to spare, no privacy to tend to their discomfort, so they turned to the simplest thing at hand, the dry remains of corn. The cobs, stripped of kernels and crumbled into soft pieces, became their makeshift remedy. It was not comfort they sought, only survival through the long, shameful days that no one dared to name aloud. The process was crude but familiar. Dried corn cobs were broken down into small tufts and rubbed between palms until they softened. The pieces were shaped into a cushion, meant to absorb what no other material could. They were wrapped in scraps of old cloth if any were available, though most could not afford even that luxury. The texture was rough and splintered, but it held moisture, and that was enough. It is grimly absurd that the same crop used to feed livestock was pressed against the most delicate parts of the body in the name of hygiene. The women endured it because there was no choice. Pain and purity had long become the same thing. The corn husks were often soaked in water or vinegar before use to soften them and reduce their coarse edges. The scent of vinegar filled the small rooms, mixing with the damp smell of earth and smoke. It did little to ease their discomfort. The edges scratched, the skin burned, but to stay dry meant to stay proper. The act of cleaning was as important as the act of concealment. Stains were moral failures, not accidents. The women worked hard to hide their suffering from everyone, even from one another. When the makeshift pads were used, they were discarded carefully. Some buried them near the fields, others burned them quietly in the hearth, watching the faint smoke rise and disappear. Fire became a kind of forgiveness, a way to erase evidence of impurity. The ash that remained was swept away before dawn. The act was private, almost sacred. If we compare this to today, it would be like using handfuls of straw or paper instead of fabric, pretending that endurance was the same as dignity. The thought feels distant now, but for them, such measures were acts of strength, not shame. Corn was common and cheap, found in every household. What had once been food now served as protection. Mothers passed the method to daughters without ceremony. There were no instructions, only imitation. The knowledge lived quietly, handed down through gesture rather than words. Even among friends, such matters were never discussed. A woman might notice the faint smell of vinegar or the way another walked carefully, but she would say nothing. Their silence was a kind of agreement. The world did not need to know. The use of corn husks also reflected the poverty that shaped their lives. Real cloth was too costly, reserved for clothing or trade. A clean rag was worth saving, not staining. The women learned to make do with what they had. Their creativity was born from deprivation, and their endurance was their only luxury. Cleanliness was measured by effort, not comfort, as long as the surface appeared neat and modest. the hidden pain did not matter. I find it quietly heartbreaking that their pursuit of purity left them bleeding from tools they created with their own hands. In wealthier homes, things were no kinder. The women there might have linen or wool, but the silence was the same. They, too, treated their bodies as burdens to be concealed. Servants washed the stained cloths in cold water, hands numb and raw, then hung them behind the kitchens to dry, far from sight. Cleanliness remained a matter of reputation, never of care. Whether rich or poor, women bore the same discomfort beneath layers of propriety. The corn pads, though temporary, offered a fragile sense of control. For a few hours, the women could move, cook, or pray without fear of embarrassment. That small freedom was enough to keep the practice alive. The simplicity of the method made it easy to repeat, generation after generation, until it became tradition. What began as desperation turned into habit, and habit became identity. At night, when the work was done and the fire burned low, some women would gather their used corn husks, burn them quietly, and watch the flames turn red and gold. The smell of burning husks filled the room, sharp and sour, but they did not flinch. The act was more than disposal. It was cleansing, a ritual of renewal before another day began. In those moments, surrounded by smoke and silence, they believed they had done something right. The story of the corn husks shows how hygiene was built on an invention born from scarcity. The need to stay clean outweighed the cost of pain. Every fragment of their method carried a kind of dignity, not because it was pleasant, but because it was endured. The corn, once a symbol of nourishment, became something else entirely, a mark of hidden suffering, an emblem of silent strength. The women of that world turned even waste into ritual. They carried their pain quietly, measuring their virtue in discomfort. To them, there was no cruelty in it, only duty. The clean surface was proof of self-control, a promise to the world that they were proper even in misery. Their faith in these methods kept them steady, even as the tools they trusted betrayed them. The image of them handling soft, crumbling husks by candlelight lingers like an echo of resignation. They sought cleanliness through materials meant for fields, not for flesh. It was not ignorance that drove them, but the cruel simplicity of having no choice. And when the ashes cooled and were swept away, another habit of hygiene awaited, one that replaced water with air and purity with the sweet, smoky scent of burning herbs. Within the dim, draughty houses of medieval towns, hands told the truth of every life. They cooked, cleaned, carried, and cared, always moving, always exposed to smoke, soil, and sweat. A woman's hands were her tools, but they also betrayed her, cracked from cold water, darkened by ash, stained by herbs or meat. Cleanliness was nearly impossible to keep, yet the need to appear refined never faded. So they found a quiet remedy: gloves made of soft leather, lined inside with crushed herbs. The scent of sage, mint, or lavender would cling faintly to their skin, masking the traces of daily labour. It was a fragile comfort, a trick of fragrance pretending to be purity. The gloves were not elegant like those worn by nobles at court. They were simple, stitched by local craftsmen from the thinnest leather they could afford. The insides were stuffed with handfuls of dried herbs, chosen for both scent and supposed healing. The idea was that the warmth of the skin would awaken the smell, letting it rise slowly as the day went on. It is darkly amusing that a handful of leaves hidden inside a glove was considered enough to erase the odour of a lifetime's work. They wore them while cooking, cleaning, or walking through markets, believing the herbs would guard against filth and disease alike. The scent served not just hygiene but identity. Mint meant freshness, sage meant protection, lavender meant calm. Each fragrance told something about the women who used it, even if only to themselves. When the smell began to fade, they replaced the herbs, pressing new ones into the lining and tying the ends with bits of thread. There was something ritualistic in it, not vanity, but quiet persistence. Clean hands were not about beauty, but about dignity. When the day's work was done, they removed the gloves carefully, setting them on windowsills or hanging them near the hearth to dry. The scent filled the room as the heat warmed the leather. It mingled with the smell of wood smoke and food, a mix both harsh and strangely comforting. The gloves absorbed everything: the sweat, the herbs, the faint reminder of labour, and when they cracked or tore, the women stitched them again, unwilling to part with something that offered even a small illusion of refinement. Some made separate pairs for different occasions. There were gloves for work, gloves for walking outside, and even gloves reserved for their monthly bleeding, a time surrounded by superstition and silence. These were filled with stronger herbs like sage and vinegar-soaked cloth, meant to hide the scent of blood. The gesture was private and unspoken. To mask that smell was to reclaim a sense of control in a world that found impurity in every corner of a woman's body. If we compare this to today, it would be like wearing scented gloves indoors just to prove we are still clean enough to be seen. The herbs were chosen with care. During summer, they picked mint from the garden. During winter, they dried sage near the fire. Each leaf was believed to carry power, to cleanse, to soothe, to heal. The scent did little in truth, but belief was stronger than reason. It calmed the mind, if not the body. They called it protection, not perfume. And in a world where soap was rare and water often foul, belief was the only shield they had. Within noble households, the same practice took on a gentler form. Gloves were embroidered, perfumed with oils, and worn by women who rarely touched anything unclean. Their hands were kept soft by servants and scented oils. But even they shared the same fear of odour, the same obsession with appearing untouched by labour. The difference between a peasant's glove and a noblewoman's one was not purpose, but polish. Both were prisons of fabric and scent, guarding against judgment more than dirt. I find it deeply human that they clung to fragrance as proof of worth, as if purity could be inhaled through the nose and believed through habit. The gloves became an extension of the body, worn until they shaped perfectly to each hand. Some women wore them even while sleeping, to let the herbs soak into the skin overnight. In the morning, they pulled them off gently and inhaled the faint traces left behind. That smell meant safety, not from disease, but from shame. It meant they had done enough to appear clean, even if they could never truly be. Over time, the gloves stiffened, darkened, and frayed, but they remained treasured. The herbs inside turned brittle, but the scent lingered faintly, trapped in the seams. The act of replacing them became a small ceremony, another quiet assertion of control in lives with few choices. Cleanliness was not measured by reality, but by scent, and scent could be shaped, hidden, and replaced. This ritual of fragrant gloves shows how deeply the desire for cleanliness ran, not just on the skin, but in the mind. They could not escape dirt, so they disguised it. The illusion was enough to make them feel human again, even proud. Beneath the smell of sage and mint was the truth of exhaustion, hidden yet ever present. That faint image of them sitting by firelight, filling gloves with herbs and pulling them over rough, trembling hands, carries a tenderness that history often forgets. They were not seeking beauty, only permission to feel clean. It was a small act of care in a world where comfort was earned through effort. When the scent faded and the gloves turned stiff, another habit of hygiene quietly emerged, one that scraped the tongue itself in pursuit of that same impossible purity. Within the quiet stillness of medieval mornings, before the sound of footsteps or the smell of bread filled the house, women began their day with a ritual that few spoke about but most performed. It involved not sewing or prayer, but the strange act of scraping their tongues clean. The tool they used looked delicate, almost ornamental, A small silver spoon with holes punched through its shallow bowl. It was not meant for food. It was designed to remove the white film that gathered on the tongue overnight, a residue they believed held sickness, sin, and bad breath. To begin the day with a clean tongue was to begin it free from impurity. The cold metal met the warmth of the mouth like a quiet shock, and though the motion was slow and small, the ritual carried a weight of discipline far beyond its simplicity. They believed that the cleanliness of the mouth reflected the cleanliness of the soul. A woman who smelled of rot or vinegar was judged as careless, while one whose breath was neutral and controlled was seen as virtuous. The spoon was their silent guardian against shame. Each scrape across the tongue left a faint sting, but also a sense of victory, a small, private triumph over the filth they could never quite escape. It is both tragic and absurd that they saw self-harm as purification, measuring their virtue by the sting of a silver edge. The spoons came in different forms. The simplest were made of tin or brass, their edges roughly hammered by local smiths. Wealthier women owned ones of silver or copper, engraved with delicate curves and patterns of vines or flowers. The holes in the spoon's head were meant to catch residue as it was dragged along the tongue, leaving behind a cleaner surface. Some spoons came with thin handles ending in tiny brushes, made from horsehair or soft reeds, used to polish the teeth afterward. They were kept beside small basins or ceramic bowls filled with rinse water, often mixed with ash, vinegar, or a few drops of honey. The mixture stung and burned, but it smelled faintly sweet. Every household had its own recipe for oral cleansing. Some used salt water for its sharpness. Others preferred vinegar mixed with honey for a balance between pain and fragrance. A few added ash or powdered herbs, believing these would draw out impurities. The taste was bitter, metallic, and sour. Yet to them it was the flavour of purity. The stronger the sting, the more effective it was thought to be. If we compare this to today, it would be like brushing our teeth with vinegar and soot, believing the burn meant success. The idea of comfort never entered the process. Pain was part of the ritual. To hurt was to be clean. The morning routine unfolded in near silence. Women would sit near a window where light filtered in softly, or stand beside a bucket of water heated faintly by the night's dying fire. They would dip the spoon, scrape once, twice, 3 times, until the tongue felt raw. The sound was faint but distinct, metal against flesh, soft and persistent. They spat into the basin, rinsed, and spat again. When they were done, their tongues felt dry, their mouths bitter. But there was satisfaction in that emptiness. They had done what was required to start the day properly. This small ritual spread through classes, from the poorest labourers to noble women behind high walls. Among the poor, the spoons were crude but effective. Among the rich, they were crafted like jewels. In manor houses, servants boiled the cleansing mixture, straining it through linen before presenting it to their mistresses. The women performed their scraping while seated at vanity tables, surrounded by mirrors, oils, and perfumes. Yet beneath the elegance, the act remained the same. The difference was only in material, not purpose. Every woman sought the same thing to appear untouched by decay, even in the breath that left her body. The practice had more meaning than mere hygiene. Medieval beliefs tied physical purity to moral strength. They thought an unclean tongue could spread lies, sin, or sickness. Scraping it was not only about removing odour, but about protecting the soul from corruption. Mothers taught their daughters to do it, warning them that a foul mouth revealed a foul heart. Over generations, the habit became instinct, performed without question. It was not seen as strange. It was a duty. The ingredients they used reveal how faith and ignorance intertwined. Honey symbolized sweetness and healing. Vinegar represented purification, and ash stood for the earth that cleansed all things. Mixed, they formed a symbolic potion of life and death, pleasant and poisonous at once. The honey softened the bitterness just enough to endure it, while the ash scoured the mouth's surface. Some even added crushed herbs, such as thyme or mint, believing these drove away illness. The taste was unpleasant, but the ritual's meaning outweighed the discomfort. When finished, they wiped the spoon clean with a strip of cloth and laid it on the hearth to dry. Over time, the edges darkened, the holes filled with residue, and the metal wore thin. Many spoons were passed down between generations, kept as small heirlooms. Daughters inherited their mother's tools of purity, carrying forward both the act and the faith that surrounded it. It was a cycle of discomfort sustained by tradition, a reminder that control over one's body was control over one's worth. I find it deeply human that they equated the bitter taste of vinegar with the comfort of moral order, as if suffering could make them clean inside. Even men practiced this ritual, though they rarely admitted it. Merchants and scholars used similar spoons, scraping before speaking in public or attending church. But for women, the act carried a heavier weight. To them, it was not only about appearance but survival. In societies where odour was equated with sin, a woman who smelled unclean risked ridicule or isolation. Every scrape of the tongue became an act of defence. There were also whispered beliefs about the tongue itself, that its residue could trap evil thoughts or curses. By scraping it, they freed themselves from hidden dangers. Some women even recited silent prayers during the process, asking for forgiveness as they worked. The spoon became both a tool and a symbol of confession. It offered no mercy, only the illusion of control over what they could not see or change. Over time, these rituals of mouth cleansing grew more elaborate. In larger towns, sellers offered ready-made mouth powders of ash, salt, and herbs, claiming they could purify breath for an entire day. Women carried small pouches of these powders, rubbing them on the tongue when travelling or visiting markets. Yet the spoon remained central, a small, personal object that turned the private act of cleaning into something sacred. After the ritual, they ate breakfast slowly, careful not to undo their effort too soon. The taste of food mingled with vinegar and ash, but they accepted it without complaint. Cleanliness was fleeting, devotion had to be constant. The mouth, they believed, was the gateway to sin. It needed guarding as much as the heart. This strange practice of tongue scraping reveals the deeper truth of their world, that purity was never about health, but about control. Their bodies were battlegrounds of faith and fear, where every sting of vinegar or scrape of metal became proof of worthiness. They turned pain into reassurance, mistaking the absence of comfort for the presence of virtue. That image of them standing before the morning light, heads bowed slightly, spoon pressed against their tongues as steam rose from the vinegar bowl, lingers like a soft ache through time. They scraped away not only residue but also doubt, seeking cleanliness in a world that offered none. It was a ritual both gentle and cruel, small in motion yet vast in meaning. When the last taste of ash faded from their mouths, they reached for another tool, one hidden beneath layers of fabric, waiting to absorb the sweat their clean tongues could never confess. Morning in medieval towns began with the sound of fabric, the rustle of layers being adjusted, tied, or pinned into place. Among those layers, hidden where no one could see, was a long strip of cloth wrapped tightly beneath the arms. It was not decoration, not comfort, but a quiet necessity. The air was heavy with sweat and smoke, and baths were rare luxuries. To survive the long days of labour, women learned to fight the body scent with cloth, vinegar, and endurance. The band under their arms was their first defence against shame, soaked not only with sweat but with the fear of being perceived as unclean. The strip was cut from worn linen or rough wool, long enough to circle the body and tie securely behind the back. It pressed firmly into the skin, absorbing the moisture that gathered with every movement. The tightness left marks by evening, red lines that stung when touched, yet few complained. Cleanliness had nothing to do with comfort. It was a discipline, a habit of control over what could not be hidden by silence. It is grimly ironic that they preferred pain over odour, wrapping themselves in discomfort to seem proper. For those who could afford it, the fabric was replaced daily. Others washed the same piece each night, scrubbing it with ash or vinegar and hanging it near the fire to dry. In poorer homes, when water was scarce, the band was left to air by the window, stiff with salt and sweat by morning. The act of putting it back on was unpleasant, but necessary. There was a strange satisfaction in the burn against freshly washed skin, a reminder that effort meant purity. The smell of vinegar lingered faintly beneath their clothing, sharp enough to mask something worse. The method was practical, if brutal. Sweat carried more than smell, it carried judgment. A woman's scent could betray her labour, her poverty, even her sin. Those who worked in markets or kitchens wore thicker bands, layering fabric under heavy gowns. The warmth was unbearable, but to go without was to risk humiliation. Women of higher rank used finer cloth, perfumed with dried herbs or oils. Beneath their silk sleeves, the same hidden bands clung to their skin, turning every gesture of elegance into an act of restraint. Some dipped their cloth in vinegar or rose water before tying it on, hoping to balance harshness with fragrance. The vinegar burned slightly, tightening the skin and stinging open pores. The sensation was strange but reassuring. It made them feel cleansed, as if the sourness itself could dissolve impurity. If we compare this to today, it would be like soaking a shirt in cleaning fluid just to prove one's worth through scent. The logic was flawed, but deeply human. They believed that odour revealed the soul, and to smell wrong was to be judged unworthy. The hidden bands were not just about hygiene, they were about dignity. In a world where a woman's body was seen as both fragile and corrupt, control over her scent meant control over her reputation. A clean appearance could protect her from ridicule, gossip, or worse. Mothers taught daughters to wrap themselves tightly, to check the cloth by touch before leaving the house. The smell of vinegar and cloth became a mark of upbringing, a sign that she knew her place in a world ruled by men and modesty. The habit followed them from youth to old age, even after marriage, even in sickness. They continued the practice. The fabric, stained and softened by years of use, was as familiar as skin. Some women kept multiple strips folded neatly in chests beside undergarments and prayer books. It was part of the rhythm of life-wake, wrap, work, wash, repeat. The motion became instinctive, performed without thought, yet filled with meaning. To neglect it was to neglect oneself. In noble households, servants performed the same ritual for their mistresses. They cut fresh strips each morning, soaked them in scented water, and tied them carefully beneath expensive gowns. The mistress might not feel the sting of vinegar or the roughness of linen, but the ritual was the same. The higher the class, the softer the cloth, but the same fear lingered underneath. Sweat, in any form, was seen as weakness. Cleanliness was performance, something worn, not lived. I find it haunting that they could hide every trace of labour, but never the effort it took to maintain the illusion. Even among the poor, there was pride in the practice. A woman who kept her clothes clean and her smell contained could walk through the market with quiet confidence. The faint scent of vinegar told others she cared for herself, that she resisted decay despite her means. Cleanliness became a kind of rebellion, proof that poverty could not strip away self-respect. The strip beneath the arms was invisible, but its meaning was heavy, an unspoken message that she still possessed control over something, even if it was only her own scent. The discomfort of wearing the band grew worse during the summer. The heat turned the fabric into a trap, and the smell of vinegar thickened in the air. Women fainted during prayers or while cooking, the cloths clinging damply to their ribs. Yet removing them was unthinkable. Better to endure faintness than shame. Cleanliness, after all, was not about relief. It was about endurance, about bearing discomfort quietly and gracefully. The bands were washed until they thinned and tore, but the habit continued. Old cloth became new. New cloth became ritual. Some women even carried small scraps in their pockets, wiping under their arms during long journeys or market days. The practice had no glamour, no luxury, only discipline. It was the unseen work behind every gesture of refinement. This simple piece of cloth reveals the contradictions of their world, that purity was pursued through methods that dirtied the skin, that fragrance was born from vinegar, that beauty hid beneath discomfort. They believed that by containing their bodies, they contained their shame. The marks left by the tight bands faded each night, only to return each morning, quiet symbols of effort mistaken for virtue. That image of them standing by dawn's dim light, winding the band beneath their arms, captures both their strength and their confinement. They did it out of pride, fear, and faith all at once. The scent of vinegar filled the air like a badge of dignity earned through pain. After the band was finally removed and hung by the fire to dry, another ritual waited, one far stranger, one that promised inner cleanliness by using a substance no one today would dare to touch. Within the quiet privacy of medieval homes, where the air smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and herbs, women carried out rituals that no one spoke of aloud. Cleanliness was an expectation, yet water was scarce, and soap was a rare privilege. They were taught that the female body was a source of impurity, something to be managed, contained, and corrected. So they searched for ways to remain pure with what little they had. Among the strangest of these methods was the use of fine wood ash, crushed into pale powder and pressed where no one could see. The ash was made from oak, peach, or willow, sifted until it felt as soft as flour. It was believed to draw out moisture, remove odour, and protect against what they could not name. They called it purification. The act was done in silence, often by firelight or behind closed shutters. Women kept small bowls or jars filled with the pale dust near their washing basins. When they felt unclean, after menstruation, after intimacy, or during the heavy heat of summer, they reached for the ash as though it were medicine. A handful was warmed slightly by the fire, then pressed into the body with care or with resignation. The dryness bit at their skin, leaving a faint burn that they mistook for freshness. It is almost absurd that they accepted pain as proof of purity, mistaking the sting of ash for the feeling of being clean. The logic seemed sound at the time. Ash was used to wash clothes, to scrub dishes, to polish metal. It removed stains and neutralized odors. Why not apply it to the body, the same properties that cleaned linen, they believed, could cleanse flesh? They thought the powder could absorb sin as easily as it absorbed sweat. In their minds, the body was a vessel that needed constant maintenance, and ash was the cheapest form of devotion available. The wood used for the ritual mattered. Oak was preferred for its strength, peach for its gentleness. Women collected the ashes from their own hearths, choosing those left from fragrant wood rather than plain logs. They ground them again with pestles until fine, then stored them in jars sealed with cloth. A few drops of vinegar or rose water might be added to mask the smell of smoke. Still, the scent of burnt wood clung to the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of vinegar. To them, this was the smell of virtue. The procedure was quiet and lonely. There was no guidance, no shared knowledge, only what one learned from whispers or from her mother's example. Some women did this daily, others only when they felt especially unclean. The ash absorbed moisture for a time, leaving the skin dry and tight. The burning that followed was ignored, interpreted as the body purging itself. Infection and pain were rarely discussed. They endured both as if they were natural, as if purity was worth a little suffering. If we compare this to today, it would be like cleaning our bodies with powdered charcoal and believing every wound it caused was a sign of success. Among the poor, The practice spread because ash was free. It came from every fire, every hearth. For noble women, the ritual took on refinement. They used ash perfumed with herbs, stored in carved boxes, and applied with linen cloths instead of fingers. Servants prepared it for them, unaware of what it was used for. In both worlds, the purpose remained the same: to silence the body's natural scent, to make it small, contained, and harmless. Religion deepened the obsession. The church preached that women were to be modest, that cleanliness was next to godliness, but offered no safe means to achieve it. Priests spoke of purity without understanding the toll it took. Women turned their faith inward, believing that pain could cleanse where prayer could not. The ash became their private sacrament, a material way to erase sin from the flesh. Every sting felt like penance, every burn felt like redemption. The consequences were cruel. Many suffered infections, fevers, or ulcers that spread unseen. Doctors, when called, blamed the women's nature, not their methods. They were told to pray harder, to avoid temptation, to accept their fragility. The idea that their suffering came from the very thing meant to save them was too unbearable to believe. So the cycle continued. Mothers passed the practice to daughters, certain it was kindness. They handed down jars of ash like heirlooms of virtue, unaware that they also handed down pain. The smell of smoke lingered on their skin, faint but constant. In the heat of summer, it mingled with sweat and vinegar, creating an odour that others interpreted as fresh. No one questioned why cleanliness always hurt. Pain was woven into the rhythm of womanhood, a quiet companion that came with every ritual. I find it unbearably sad that they fought their own bodies so earnestly, believing purity demanded self-destruction. Yet in that sadness lies a strange dignity. They did what they could in a world that gave them no better tools, no mercy, and no understanding. Even in noble houses, the story was the same. The ash was finer, the jars prettier, the pain identical. Some women burned incense after the ritual to mask the scent, filling their rooms with a haze of smoke that symbolized holiness. The air shimmered faintly, carrying both perfume and the memory of fire. Cleanliness became performance, repeated until it felt like truth. Over time, some began to replace ash with crushed flowers or herbal powders, softer but still drying. These small changes did little to ease the harm. The belief remained untouched. They still equated dryness with virtue, burning with purity, and silence with morality. To be soft or moist or natural was considered sinful, signs of indulgence rather than life. This ritual of ash reveals a cruel balance between faith and ignorance. It shows how far they went to control what they could not change, how deeply shame governed their sense of self. The idea that a woman must erase her own scent, her own comfort, to be worthy of respect speaks volumes about their world. Cleanliness was never about health. It was about invisibility. They wanted to disappear beneath layers of ritual until nothing impure or human remained. This image of them crouched near the hearth, pressing warm ash into their own skin, glows faintly in memory like the dying fire beside them. They believed they were cleansing themselves, but in truth, they were carrying the hearth's embers into their own bodies. The air was heavy with smoke and silence, both of which they mistook for holiness. After the ritual ended, they rose slowly, aching but proud, convinced they had done something righteous. Yet soon another ritual waited, one meant to soothe what the ash had destroyed, using steam and scent to chase away the pain that purity had left behind. Within the slow rhythm of medieval mornings, before the sun fully reached the small windows and before the first meal was prepared, women turned to their quiet rituals of cleanliness. Among the simplest tools they used was something humble, a small ball of wool tied to a short wooden stick. It served as their cloth, their sponge, and sometimes their only luxury. Dipped in water scented with herbs, it was pressed gently against the skin to remove the dust of sleep. To modern eyes, it might seem crude, but to them it was the closest thing to self-care, a way to begin the day feeling touched by freshness rather than by labour. The wool was soft at first, freshly carded from sheep and washed in lye, but over time it hardened from use. The women made these little wands themselves, wrapping the wool tightly and tying it with twine or thread. Each one was personal, shaped by the hand that made it. They dipped it into bowls filled with water steeped in rosemary, thyme, or marjoram, herbs that promised not only scent but protection from illness. The mixture was cool against their faces, and the smell of herbs clung faintly to their skin. It is quietly funny that they called it cleansing, though it was little more than moving yesterday's smoke and dust from one place to another. Still, the act gave them a small sense of peace. Water was rarely clear in those days, drawn from wells that carried silt and sometimes worse, so the herbal water was believed to purify. The women washed slowly, letting the droplets slide down their necks, feeling the texture of the wool roll softly across their skin. It scratched slightly, not painfully, but enough to remind them that cleanliness came with effort. The reflection, whether in a basin or the dull gleam of a pot, showed no transformation, but they felt renewed all the same. When the washing was done, they hung the woolen wand near the hearth to dry. The smoke that curled from the fire served as a kind of invisible shield, killing what they thought were invisible impurities. The scent of herbs deepened as the smoke passed over it, leaving behind an aroma both sharp and earthy. To them, this was proof that the tool had been sanctified, cleansed by fire and air. Every morning, the same cycle repeated: dip, press, hang, dry, and start again. The process became both habit and comfort, something steady in a world that offered little stability. In wealthier homes, the same ritual took on grace. Servants prepared the herbal mixtures in advance, using silver bowls or ceramic basins, filling them with warm water scented with rosemary and mint. The mistress of the house would wash her face with the wool wand while seated by the window, her movements slow and deliberate, as though performing a sacred rite. The scent of the herbs drifted through the room, mixing with perfume and candle wax. The water shimmered briefly in the morning light before being poured away. Whether rich or poor, they all sought the same small miracle, the feeling of being momentarily clean in a world of endless dirt. For many, the ritual went beyond hygiene. It was emotional, even spiritual. The water touched what prayer could not, the face, the visible proof of life's fatigue. Some whispered blessings while washing, asking for strength, for patience, or simply for another quiet day. The warmth of the herbs on their skin was comforting, a reminder that they still belong to the living. If we compare this to today, it would be like washing our faces with a piece of old wool dipped in herbal tea and calling it luxury. Yet for them, it truly was. The sensation of coolness, the faint fragrance, and the moment of stillness were rare gifts. The wool wands varied in colour and texture. Some were pale and clean, others darkened with age and use. Women replaced them only when they unravelled or smelled too strongly of smoke. They were not thrown away easily. Even worn ones were rinsed and reused, the fibres tightening with each wash until they became as firm as leather. The friction left faint red marks on the cheeks, which were sometimes mistaken for a healthy glow. To the women, that warmth meant the herbs were working. The ritual was passed down quietly from mother to daughter. A mother would show her child how to wrap the wool tightly, how to mix the right amount of herb into the water, how to hang the wand at just the right distance from the fire so it dried without burning. It was knowledge born from repetition, preserved without words. The tools were simple, but the care was exact. The way they treated that small ball of wool said everything about their world, that nothing was wasted, that even cleansing was an act of patience. Sometimes, they used the wand not only on their faces but on their hands and necks, rubbing gently to remove soot and oil. The skin tingled from the roughness, but they endured it. believing that the slight discomfort meant the dirt had truly gone. The water turned cloudy with each use, but they never discarded it immediately. It was sprinkled over the floor to settle dust or poured onto herbs growing near the door. Cleanliness, in their understanding, was never confined to one act. It was a cycle of renewal shared between body, home, and earth. I find it oddly moving that such a small tool, a tuft of wool on a stick, could carry so much hope. In their hands, it was more than a cleaning tool. It was proof of care, persistence, and a yearning for order in a world that gave them neither. Each morning, they recreated the same fragile illusion of freshness, and in that illusion, they found meaning. This small woolen wand, with its mingled scent of herbs and smoke, captures the essence of their daily battle against decay. It was their way of saying they still mattered, that even amid soot and labour, they could begin the day with gentleness. The act was brief, forgotten by midday, but it shaped their mornings for centuries. This glimpse of them standing by the hearth, dipping the soft wool into herbal water and pressing it against their faces, lingers quietly in time. They sought purity not in perfection, but in the repetition of care. Each touch of the wool was a promise that they could begin again, even if the world around them never changed. After the wool dried and the herbs lost their scent, another ritual waited, one that reached deeper into the body, cleansing not the surface but the secret spaces that carried both shame and strength. Inside the damp stillness of medieval homes, where walls sweated with soot and the smell of smoke clung to every corner, women kept strange little tools for their daily care. Among the oddest was a small bundle of feathers tied together with twine, its ends frayed from constant use, made from the soft down of chickens or rabbits. This peculiar brush was meant not for painting or dusting, but for cleaning one's nose. The idea was simple enough to seem harmless: clear the nostrils, breathe better, stay healthy. Yet the image of women poking feathers into their noses, their faces lit by flickering firelight, says more about their world than any sermon on cleanliness ever could. Each brush was made by hand. Mothers collected fallen feathers from their yards, washing them in vinegar and drying them by the hearth. When tied around a small stick or bone, they became little instruments of ritual. The brush would be dipped in water scented with rosemary or sage, then carefully inserted into the nose to stir out dust and ash. The tickling made most people sneeze, but that was taken as proof that it worked. They believed the sneeze expelled bad air and invisible poisons from the body. It is both comical and grim that they trusted feathers more than medicine, as if discomfort itself could cleanse the soul. The ritual was not limited to adults. Children, especially daughters, were expected to use the feather brush before sleep. Mothers supervised the act with patience and authority, insisting it prevented colds and nightmares alike. A child who refused might be scolded or coaxed with promises of good fortune. The sight of a mother holding the tiny bundle of feathers near her daughter's face was both intimate and unsettling. The girl wrinkled her nose, eyes watering, but endured it. In that brief exchange of care and discomfort lay the heart of their beliefs that cleanliness required obedience. The tool itself was fragile but enduring. When the feathers grew stiff or darkened, women would trim their ends and hang the brush above the fireplace to purify it with smoke. The air around it filled with a mixed scents of wood and vinegar, sharp but strangely comforting. Each home carried its own aroma, part cleanliness, part decay. In wealthier houses, the same tool was refined. Feathers were wrapped in silk thread, and some were even dipped in perfume or fitted with small bronze handles. The act of cleaning the nose became a mark of civility rather than necessity. To be refined meant to endure discomfort with grace. Among the poor, the brush was simpler. A splinter of firewood served as the handle, bound with feathers taken from the family's own hens. These humble tools hung beside combs and spoons, part of a small but sacred collection of daily instruments. The women used them each morning after washing their faces with herbal water. It was not only a matter of hygiene but of dignity. In a life of constant labour, small gestures of care reminded them that they were still human. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like dipping a feather duster in vinegar and gently stirring one's nostrils while believing it kept the soul pure. The feather brush was also bound to belief. Medieval people thought that sickness came through bad air, a force carried invisibly through breath. To clean the nose, then, was to guard against sin and disease at once. The act carried both medical and moral weight. Some believed it could ward off evil spirits that entered through the nose during sleep. Others claimed that perfumed feathers pleased the angels and kept the devil away. Science and superstition blended seamlessly, as they so often did. In noble households, servants prepared the brushes and water each morning. Ladies sat before their mirrors, faces pale in candlelight, while a maid carefully inserted the feather brush. The ladies rarely flinched. Their composure was a performance of virtue, a sign that they were untouched by the roughness of the world. The scent of herbs and smoke filled the room, mingling with wax and linen. It was a moment of quiet order before the day's chaos began. Cleanliness, even absurd cleanliness, became a language of control. Mothers continued this habit with their children, teaching them that purity began with discomfort. Some even kept the brushes as keepsakes after their children grew older, tucking them into chests with ribbons or rosaries. A feather brush could outlast its owner, passed down like a strange family relic. It carried no real beauty, yet it symbolized devotion. To neglect such a ritual was unthinkable, especially for women, whose worth was often measured in the neatness of their bodies and homes. The air in those homes was heavy with contradiction. While women cleaned their noses with feathers dipped in vinegar, soot from the hearth blackened the ceiling, and the floor was slick with mud. The body could be made to look disciplined even when the world around it refused to be. The ritual said more about control than about cleanliness. To keep the nose clean was to insist that order still existed, that even in poverty one could appear proper. I find it strangely moving that an act so absurd could carry such meaning. The feather brush, both ridiculous and sincere, showed how far they would go to keep the illusion of purity alive. They believed that through small acts of care they could hold decay at bay, but no amount of feather brushing could change the air they breathed, thick with ash and disease. Still, they tried, and in that effort lay something quietly human. This image lingers, mothers by the fire, dipping feathers in herbal water, children blinking back tears as they submit to the ritual. The light trembles across their faces, and for a moment, the act feels almost tender. But tenderness in that world was always tangled with fear. The feather brush dried above the fire, its ends curling, waiting for the next morning. Somewhere in that cycle of smoke and care, they convinced themselves that the world was still cleanable. When the last feather burned away and the ritual lost its power, another practice awaited, one harsher, meant to cleanse what feathers could never reach. Inside the stone walls of medieval homes, where light barely reached the corners and the air was heavy with damp smoke, hygiene was a matter of necessity, not comfort. Among the strangest habits of that time was the use of cloth soaked in ash as a tool for cleaning after relieving oneself. These small strips of fabric, darkened and rough from repeated use, served the same purpose that paper serves now, though the process was far more unpleasant. To them, this was an act of cleanliness, a mark of discipline and modesty. To us, it seems almost unthinkable. The body was a vessel that demanded constant control, and even its most private moments were shaped by ritual. The clothes were made from scraps of linen, torn from old garments or household rags. Women often prepared them at home, cutting them into long, narrow strips before soaking them in fine ash from the hearth. The ash came from burned wood, oak, pine, or willow, and was believed to hold cleansing properties. When mixed with water, it formed a coarse paste that clung to the fibres. Once the fabric was wrung and dried, It became mildly abrasive, a primitive version of soap and scrub in one. The texture was harsh, but to them, that roughness meant purity. They thought the pain or sting of it proved that filth was truly gone. It is grimly amusing that what they called clean was often the very thing that hurt most. When the time came to use it, the cloth was dipped in water again to soften it. Afterward, it was rinsed and sometimes hung near the fireplace to dry for reuse. In poorer homes, where water was scarce and soap expensive, the same piece might last for days. The smell of ash mingled with the sourness of damp fabric, a scent both familiar and tolerated. It was part of life, a quiet compromise between need and disgust. To throw it away after one use would have been seen as wasteful, even sinful. In wealthier households, the same idea took on refinement. The ash came from aromatic wood, or was mixed with herbs like sage or rosemary to disguise the odour. Servants were expected to prepare the clothes daily, keeping them neatly folded in a small wooden box beside the chamber pot. The mistress of the house might believe that the herbs sanctified the act, turning necessity into ritual. Cleanliness was not just about the body, it was about maintaining control, dignity, and the illusion of grace even in private. For the poor, however, the cloth was little more than a survival tool. They had no privacy, often using shared spaces behind cottages or near the edge of fields. A single strip of ash-soaked fabric might be passed between family members, rinsed briefly in the same bucket of grey water used for washing dishes. It was not pleasant, but it was all they had. They believed that the ash itself carried power, that it protected them from infection and from evil spirits that might enter through the body's most vulnerable places. If one were to compare it to modern times, it would be like using sandpaper dipped in detergent and calling it hygienic. The ash came from the same fire that warmed their food, their beds, and their homes. Fire was purity, and by extension, so was ash. It symbolized what was burned away: sin, disease, and decay. To wash with it, even in such a crude manner, was an act of both cleansing and faith. Women taught their daughters how to prepare it properly, emphasizing the right texture and the right wood to use. Oak was considered strong and cleansing, while pine was thought to heal. These teachings passed quietly through generations, never questioned, only repeated, once used. The clothes were not simply discarded. Many believed that waste carried a piece of the soul, and to leave such things exposed risked inviting curses or illness. The used strips were often buried in small holes behind the house, covered with dirt and stones. Some women whispered prayers as they did so, asking the earth to swallow the impurity and keep it from returning. It was part hygiene, part superstition, but entirely sincere. To them, cleansing was not just physical, it was spiritual defense. The act itself was done in silence. There was no shame in it, but neither was there openness. Everyone knew it was necessary, but no one spoke of it. The harshness of the cloth left the skin raw, yet they accepted it as the price of cleanliness. Over time, women's hands grew used to preparing these fabrics, their fingers grey with ash, their nails stained from scrubbing. The smell of smoke and earth followed them everywhere, mingling with the scent of herbs and sweat. In a world where water was cold and rare, ash was warmth, and warmth meant life. Even among the upper classes who owned finer versions of nearly everything, this custom remained unchanged. Gold mirrors and embroidered gowns might fill their rooms, but beside the chamber pot still lay a strip of grey cloth, waiting. The contrast was startling. Refinement built atop filth, grace balanced on discomfort. Cleanliness was appearance, not reality. I find it haunting how something meant to purify could feel so degrading, yet they performed it with quiet pride. What this ritual reveals is not only how they lived, but how they thought. The body was a thing to be mastered, scrubbed, and silenced. Comfort was suspect. Pain was proof of effort. They had no concept of softness in cleanliness. To them, a smooth surface was deceitful. True purity had to scrape. The fire that burned their wood, the ash that touched their skin, and the earth that buried their waste all formed a continuous circle of endurance. The image that remains is simple yet unsettling: a woman crouched near the hearth, dipping a strip of grey cloth into water darkened by ash, her hands trembling from the cold, her face expressionless. Around her, the room hums with the faint crackle of fire. The air smells of smoke and something else, human effort, perhaps. She folds the cloth neatly after use, as if tidying away a secret. Outside, the ground bears the small mounds where yesterday's clothes lie buried. Beneath the silence, there is dignity, persistence, and a strange, unyielding belief that this, too, was a kind of purity. The image of those buried cloths lingers like a quiet confession beneath the soil. Each one carried away what could not be spoken of, hidden under the same earth that gave them life. It was their way of ending the ritual, of sealing impurity beneath silence. Yet when the ashes cooled and the ground settled, another practice awaited, one that reached deeper into the body, promising to destroy what they feared most but leaving only pain behind. Among the quiet horrors of medieval hygiene, few practices revealed as much desperation as the use of plant roots for cleansing the body. Women believed the world was full of invisible dangers, spirits, sickness, and creatures that crept unseen beneath the skin. When they felt an itch, a swelling, or a strange pain, they did not have doctors to consult. Only whispers passed between mothers and daughters. Among these whispered cures was one particularly cruel remedy, inserting the root of a nettle plant deep into the body to kill what they called worms or insects inside. It was meant to heal from within, but in truth it wounded more than it ever cured. The roots were collected from the edges of fields or near old walls where wild plants thrived. Women pulled them from the soil with bare hands, shaking off dirt and trimming them with knives blackened from the hearth. Once cut, the roots were soaked in vinegar or herbal water to activate their cleansing power. The logic was simple: the stronger the sting, the deeper the cleaning. It was believed that pain was proof that the body's evils were being destroyed. It is darkly ironic that they mistook burning flesh for healing, thinking agony itself was the path to purity. When the ritual began, the room was often dim, lit only by a single oil lamp. A woman would sit near the fire, holding the pale root between her fingers. The air smelled of smoke, vinegar, and earth. She would close her eyes, whisper a prayer, and insert the root into her body before lying still for hours. By morning, her skin burned, and sometimes the pain turned to fever. Yet she endured it in silence, believing that whatever harm she suffered was necessary to cleanse her from within. The root of the nettle was chosen for its sting. It burned the skin, creating the illusion of life fighting against decay. To those who used it, that sharpness felt like strength. They imagined the root devouring the worms of illness, purging sin and sickness together. Women who could not afford medicine saw no other choice. There were no healers for the poor, no comfort for the desperate. The body had to become its own cure, even if the cure destroyed it. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like treating an infection by placing acid on the skin and calling the burning a sign of progress. Mothers passed this knowledge to their daughters as a kind of sacred secret. They spoke softly about its power, about how the pain meant it was working. To refuse the practice was to invite shame. Those who suffered in silence were considered brave, clean, and faithful. Men rarely knew of it. Women carried the ritual alone. It was an inheritance of discomfort, a private sacrifice disguised as care. The morning after, some women could not walk easily. Their skin blistered and their bodies ached. They rubbed herbs or honey to soothe the wounds, then washed with cold water or ash. No one spoke of the damage. To them, such pain was simply a toll of womanhood, another burden to be carried quietly. a woman who complained was seen as weak or ungrateful for her health. Pain, once again, was virtue. The church encouraged purity but offered little comfort. Priests preached about sin entering through the body, and women listened, absorbing guilt until it became habit. The nettle root ritual was never officially sanctioned, yet it fit perfectly with the logic of their world. If sin lived in the flesh, then the flesh must be punished. They did not see it as cruelty, they saw it as cleansing. Each sting was a step toward holiness. The line between medicine and penance blurred until they were the same. In some places, women used other roots, flax, garlic, or thorn, each promising a different effect. But nettle was the most feared and the most respected. It symbolized endurance. Its sting was known, its burn expected. The ritual was often performed during the changing seasons, when illness was said to travel through the air. They believed it kept the body strong, sealed against invisible corruption. In truth, it weakened them further. Many fell ill afterward, some died quietly, their wounds hidden under layers of linen. No one blamed the ritual. They blamed their own impurity for not being strong enough to withstand it. The act left no record except for the scars it caused and the memories carried through generations. The roots rotted quickly, the pain faded slowly, and life continued as before. The ritual was repeated again and again because it gave a sense of control in a world that offered none. Women did what they could to survive, and survival often looked like suffering. Something is haunting about how belief can turn injury into devotion, how pain becomes comfort when all else is uncertain. What remains most striking is how ordinary it all was. No one thought it monstrous. It was simply what women did to remain pure, to stay desirable, to protect their bodies from unseen harm. The line between care and cruelty dissolved long ago, and they lived within that blur as naturally as breathing. The nettle root was both medicine and punishment, both faith and failure. It burned, and they thanked it for burning. This image lingers. Women crouch near the hearth, the glow of fire reflecting on their faces as they press roots into small clay bowls, the smell of smoke and damp soil mixing with fear and duty. They believed they were stronger for it, that suffering made them whole. But the more they tried to cleanse, the more the body turned against itself. Their silence became the only balm, their endurance the only relief. The memory of such rituals tells more about their world than words ever could. It was a time when pain was proof of virtue, when self-inflicted wounds were mistaken for grace. They trusted the earth to heal them, even when it burned them alive from within. And when the pain subsided, they rose, adjusted their garments, and moved on, carrying the scent of vinegar and ash like a badge of resilience. The story of the nettle root ends not with healing, but with acceptance, of pain, of silence, of endless endurance. They endured because there was no other way to live. Once the root was gone and the fever passed, another form of purification awaited, one gentler in form but born of the same fear, the cleansing of the body through rising steam, where heat was meant to soothe what the earth had scorched. In the stillness of medieval homes, where fire was both danger and comfort, women practiced one of the most peculiar forms of cleansing, sitting above steaming pots filled with herbs, fruit peels, and fragrant bark. The ritual was simple but solemn. A clay pot was set over the hearth, water simmering with sage, orange peel, or pomegranate rind. When the air grew thick with steam, a woman would take her seat on a wooden stool carved with a small hole in its centre, allowing the rising heat to touch the most private part of her body. To her, it was not indulgence but duty. The ritual was a quiet act of faith, meant to restore purity after menstruation or intimacy. The women who performed it often did so alone, early in the morning or late at night, when others slept. The room was dim, filled with the scent of herbs and smoke. Their dresses were gathered around their waists, skin flushed from the warmth. They believed the steam would draw out impurities, cleanse away sins of the flesh, and bring balance to the body. It is strangely tragic that what they called purification was often a form of slow scalding disguised as care. The heat comforted at first, but beneath that comfort lay danger. The steam could burn, and the herbs sometimes caused irritation or infection, yet they endured the discomfort in silence, because discomfort was proof of virtue. The ingredients themselves varied by region. In the countryside, they used what nature offered: rosemary, mint, laurel leaves, and sometimes wildflowers dried beside the hearth. In wealthier homes, apothecaries prepared special blends, crushed with pestles of bronze and wrapped in fine cloth. The choice of herbs was not random. Sage was said to purify, pomegranate promised fertility, and orange peel was believed to drive out sickness. It was a mixture of medicine, superstition, and faith. The steam rose like a prayer, invisible yet sacred. As the ritual continued, the sound of bubbling water echoed softly. The woman sat motionless, breathing in the warmth, her face calm though her body trembled. She might whisper short prayers or count her breaths, as if time itself could be purified through repetition. When the session ended, she would stand slowly, dry her skin with a rough cloth, and pour the remaining water into the earth outside. The act was complete, but the belief lingered that the body had been cleansed not only of dirt, but of sin. The same fire that cooked their meals was used for this ritual, merging daily survival with spiritual duty. In their minds, cleanliness and holiness were inseparable. A clean body was a moral one, and impurity was as much a threat to the soul as to the flesh. The body was a vessel to be disciplined, never indulged. Steam became their silent confessor, a way to wash away guilt without words. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like sitting above a pot of boiling water scented with soap, and believing the pain it caused made the soul lighter. Women shared the practice among themselves, never questioning its logic. Mothers taught daughters when to perform it, how long to sit, and which herbs worked best. They passed down the idea that warmth was healing, that heat could undo whatever time and sin had left behind. It became a generational rhythm, pain followed by relief, relief followed by the illusion of purity. To them, this balance was normal, even beautiful. In the upper classes, the ritual took on elegance. Wealthy women had carved chairs specifically made for steaming, with embroidered covers to preserve modesty. Servants tended the fire, ensuring the heat stayed steady. The fragrance of herbs filled their chambers, mingling with perfume and candle wax. Even then, beneath all refinement, the principle was the same: purification through discomfort. The richer the setting, the more elaborate the suffering appeared. For poorer women, the same ritual was performed with crude tools: a cracked pot, a stool with a missing leg, and herbs scavenged from the field all served the same purpose. They sat above smoke and steam, not because it was pleasant, but because it was the only method they knew. Their belief gave meaning to pain, turning necessity into ritual. The idea of being clean again was powerful enough to make them ignore the risk of burns or infection. They had little else to control in life, but they could control this. Doctors of the time rarely understood or addressed women's health. Their silence forced women to invent their own remedies. The steaming ritual filled that void. It was treatment, confession, and prayer in one. Some women said it soothed their aches. Others believed it kept them fertile. A few even claimed it restored youth. These beliefs persisted, not because they were effective, but because they gave comfort in a world where suffering was expected. There is something quietly devastating about how they sought purity in ways that left their bodies scarred, but their faith intact. After the ritual, they often slept deeply, wrapped in blankets that still smelled of sage and smoke. The fire burned low, and the pot sat cooling beside the ashes. For a moment, the world felt clean. But by morning, the illusion faded. The same dirt, the same air, the same burdens returned. Yet they repeated the act again and again, as if trying to remind themselves that some part of life could still be made pure through effort. The image remains vivid, a woman in the flicker of firelight, skin damp with steam, her face calm but distant, the room filled with the bitter-sweet scent of herbs. She believes in the ritual with all her heart, unaware of how it betrays her. The warmth becomes both her comfort and her punishment, a perfect reflection of the world that taught her such contradictions. The steaming ritual reveals how deeply pain was woven into their understanding of womanhood. Cleanliness was never gentle, it was endurance dressed as grace. Even the most private acts became public duties in the name of morality. The steam rose and disappeared, but the belief stayed, clinging to their bodies like smoke. When the warmth finally faded, another custom took its place, one that traded heat for scent, replacing steam with the faint fragrance of flowers trapped inside animal skin. In the dim glow of medieval chambers, where the air often hung heavy with smoke and sweat, women turned to strange and inventive ways to mask the scent of their bodies. Among the most curious was a handmade fragrance tool crafted not from glass or metal, but from pigskin. It was soft yet thick, sewn carefully into a small pouch with tiny holes pricked along its surface. Inside, they stuffed dried petals, herbs, and bits of resin. When squeezed, a faint cloud of perfumed air escaped, carrying the illusion of cleanliness with it. The scent was fleeting, but in their world, it meant everything. The idea of perfuming the body was not about luxury, it was about survival. Without access to frequent bathing, the human smell became an unavoidable companion. Women feared that odour would expose them, that it marked sin, illness, or moral decay. The pigskin spray, if it could be called that, offered a kind of armour. When pressed gently beneath their skirts, it released hints of lavender, sage, or rose, masking what they believed should never be revealed. It is strangely ironic that the same society obsessed with purity relied on animal flesh to simulate cleanliness. The process of making these sprays was intimate and laborious. They softened the pig skin by soaking it in oil, then filled it with a blend of dried flowers and crushed herbs. Some added powdered myrrh or resin to make the scent linger. The opening was stitched shut, and tiny punctures were made across the surface using a heated needle. When squeezed, warm air from the body helped release the fragrance through those holes. It was not a perfume as we know it now, but rather a device of illusion, one that promised refinement while concealing discomfort. For noble women, this ritual became an art. Recipes were guarded like family treasures, whispered from one generation to the next. The ingredients spoke of status, imported spices from distant lands, rare blossoms from monastery gardens, oils carried in tiny flasks across mountains and seas. A noble woman's scent was part of her identity. To smell pleasant was to be perceived as virtuous, composed, untouched by the filth of ordinary life. If we compare it to today, it would be like hiding one's unwashed skin beneath expensive perfume and calling it elegance. But for the poor, imitation was survival. They gathered what the fields offered, crushed mint, dried violets, rosemary, or even hay steeped in vinegar. Their mixtures smelled harsh, sometimes sour, but it was enough to show they cared about propriety. The pigskin pouch, though crude, was something they could make at home. Mothers taught daughters how to stitch them tightly, warning that too many holes would waste the fragrance. These small acts of instruction became their way of passing down dignity through craft. The placement of the perfume was always discreet. Some tucked it into layers of their skirts, near the thigh or hip. Others placed it under the bodice, believing that warmth helped the scent travel upward. The air around them carried subtle traces of flowers and vinegar, a strange blend of sweetness and sharpness. In crowded rooms or during long prayers, the faint smell offered reassurance that they appeared clean. What mattered most was not being pure, but seeming pure. There was something ritualistic about the way they handled these pouches. A lady might press one before entering a church, or before lying with her husband, or before visiting friends. Each squeeze was a quiet declaration of control. To release fragrance was to silence judgment, to rewrite what the body revealed. No one spoke openly about why it was necessary. Everyone understood without words. Over time, the practice evolved into a mark of status. Perfume became not just a means of covering scent, but of displaying refinement. Nobility flaunted their fragrances as proof of breeding, while the poor tried to imitate them with whatever herbs they could find. The air of difference was literal. One smelled of roses, the other of smoke. Yet both were united by the same fear of being unclean. Beneath every layer of fragrance was anxiety, a belief that one's worth depended on hiding what was natural. The irony deepened when one realized that the pigskin itself retained odor. Despite the herbs inside, it absorbed sweat and body oils, eventually turning rancid. They replaced the contents often, scraping away the mold that gathered along the seams. Still, they kept using it. The illusion mattered more than the truth. The body could suffer as long as the air around it smelled pleasant. I find it quietly tragic how something made to mask decay became a symbol of grace. The scents that filled these rooms were more than decoration. They were survival. In a world where water was scarce and the body was seen as dangerous, fragrance was redemption. Each press of the pouch was a small victory against shame. The smell of herbs and flowers drifted through homes thick with dust, briefly transforming them into sanctuaries of imagined purity. But the illusion was fragile. The same hands that crafted those delicate pouches would later return to scrub pots, clean floors, or tend to fires that filled the air with soot once more. The memory of these perfumed pouches lingers like the faint scent of wilted flowers. They were gestures of hope disguised as hygiene, attempts to make the unbearable more bearable. The women who made them were not vain, but exhausted, fighting decay with what little beauty they could create. Their perfumes did not last, but for a moment they could breathe easier, believing they had conquered their own nature. That fragile image, women standing by the fire, pressing pouches of pigskin beneath their gowns as steam curls from their breath, captures the contradiction of their world. They were both victims and creators, both trapped and proud. The scent that rose was their defiance, their faith, their disguise. When the fragrance faded, another form of cleansing awaited, one that used not herbs or flowers, but smoke itself, to wash what even scent could not hide. In the cold, dim spaces of medieval homes, where water was precious and baths were rare, women turned to smoke to cleanse what could not be washed. The ritual was simple, but carried the weight of belief. A small pile of fragrant leaves, rosemary, sage, or juniper, was placed into a clay stove or metal basin. When lit, the leaves released a thick, curling smoke that filled the room with the scent of burning herbs and ash. Women stood above it, lifting their skirts just enough for the warmth to reach their skin, letting the smoke wrap around their bodies. To them, this was purification, a sacred act that drove away dirt, odour, and invisible sickness. The air burned their throats, their eyes watered, yet they remained still. In their minds, pain was proof of cleansing. They performed the ritual after long travels, after illness, or after childbirth, when the body was believed to be especially vulnerable to infection and evil spirits. The smoke was said to close the body's open channels, sealing it from harm. It carried both comfort and fear. Comfort because it felt like protection, and fear because without it, they believed the body might rot from within. It is almost absurd that they trusted fire and ash more than water, as if the air itself could scrub away sin. The scent of burning herbs clung to everything. It filled the walls, the fabric of dresses, and the hair of the women themselves. For hours after the ritual, they carried the smell wherever they went. To outsiders, it might have seemed heavy or strange. but in their world it was the scent of health and discipline. Those who did not perform smoke baths were thought careless or unclean. The idea of being washed by air became a quiet standard of decency, especially among women who had no access to clean water or privacy. The instruments used for the ritual were humble yet sacred. A clay pot, blackened by years of fire, served as the hearth. Some used iron pans or small braziers lined with ash to keep the embers alive. They would crouch or stand over it, adjusting their skirts or blankets to trap the heat. In wealthier homes, there were special stools carved with openings to allow the smoke to rise more efficiently. These objects were passed from mother to daughter, as essential to womanhood as a comb or a mirror. The smoke bath was not just about cleanliness, it was about renewal, after days of labour, childbirth, or sickness. The act of standing above the fire felt like returning to life. The warmth soothed sore muscles, the scent quieted the mind, and the rising smoke seemed to carry away exhaustion. They believed it purged the bad air from their lungs, the bad blood from their flesh, and the bad thoughts from their souls. If one were to compare it to modern times, it would be like walking through a room filled with incense and believing that each breath made the body cleaner than water ever could. In noble households, the ritual was made more refined. Servants prepared the herbs and fanned the smoke to keep it steady. The lady of the house would stand upon a carved stool, her jewellery glinting faintly in the haze, her eyes closed as if in prayer. For a few moments, the air seemed sacred, heavy with perfume and faith. Yet beneath all the ceremony, it was still the same act, smoke touching skin, belief covering fear. The tools were finer, the gestures slower, but the meaning was unchanged. In poorer homes, the scene was harsher. The fire smoked unevenly, and the leaves were often damp. Women coughed as they stood, their bare feet blackened by soot. The scent was not delicate, but bitter, a mixture of burned bark and sweat. Yet they endured it without complaint. For them, smoke was a gift, cheaper than soap, cleaner than nothing. It gave them the illusion of order, of doing something to keep decay away. In a world where dirt was endless, illusion was a kind of mercy. The ritual also had spiritual meaning. Many believed that the smoke carried prayers to heaven, that as it rose, it cleansed not just the body but the soul. It was said that spirits feared the smell of certain herbs, so the act of standing above the smoke became both cleansing and protection. Mothers performed it for their daughters after childbirth, whispering blessings to guard them from harm. The heat burned softly at first, then more fiercely, but they accepted it as part of womanhood. The body, after all, was meant to endure. There is something quietly moving in how they tried to replace water with air, fire, and faith. The ritual was both beautiful and terrible, a mix of devotion and desperation. It spoke of lives lived in scarcity, where warmth replaced comfort and belief replaced reason. The smoke made them cough, yet they stood proudly within it, convinced that the body must suffer to stay pure. When the ritual ended, the room was filled with haze, the air heavy with burnt herbs. The floor shimmered faintly in the dull light of embers. Women stepped away from the basin, their faces flushed, their eyes glistening. The scent of smoke clung to them, sharp and bitter-sweet. They would dress again in silence, feeling both lighter and tired. Outside, the wind carried away what was left of the fire, and for a brief moment, the world smelled clean. The image that lingers is hauntingly simple women standing over a fading fire, their bodies outlined in haze, their faith stronger than their fear. They cleanse themselves not through water but through endurance, teaching each generation that pain meant purity. It was an act of care born from necessity, repeated until it became truth. That moment of standing above the smoke captures everything about their world fragile, sincere, and endlessly resigned. The smoke rose, vanished, and left them believing they were renewed. But when the embers cooled, another practice awaited, one that carried the same promise of cleanliness, only this time through the burning sting of something far more potent and dangerous. Among the strangest of all medieval hygiene rituals was one whispered in private, performed in fear, and justified through faith the use of raw garlic inside the body. It was believed that the strong scent of garlic could drive away not only sickness, but also the evil spirits said to cling to women. In a world where illness had no clear cause and purity was a matter of survival, they trusted the sting of the herb more than the comfort of reason. A clove of garlic was crushed, wrapped in thin cloth, and placed where no one could see, left there overnight like an offering to invisible forces. The act was both desperate and disciplined, a way of reclaiming control in a life ruled by superstition. The smell of garlic was not considered shameful then. It was a smell of protection, of strength, of something that lived between the kitchen and the sacred. They believed the body could become a doorway for unseen evil, that disease and impurity came from spirits rather than germs. To fight this, they used what they knew: fire, smoke, vinegar, and now garlic. It was an extension of every other ritual of pain they had endured. It is both grim and absurd that they feared demons but welcomed burns, as if pain itself was the only language purity could speak. The preparation was always the same. Women peeled and crushed the garlic with the back of a knife, releasing its sharp oils. They wrapped it in cloth, usually linen from an old garment, thin enough to allow the fumes to pass through. Some tied the fabric with thread, others left it loose. The garlic was then inserted gently, though the result was never gentle. The oil stung the skin, burning as they seeped in, but that pain was mistaken for proof that the ritual was working. The next morning, when the cloth was removed, the air in the room carried a pungent odour that lingered long after. They saw this as victory, the scent of cleansing, overpowering whatever impurity had once lived inside. This belief was not new. Garlic had long been tied to superstition. It hung above doorways to keep away curses. It was burned in homes to repel spirits, and it was worn as a charm around the neck during illness. The idea that it could protect the body from within seemed like a natural extension of those customs. Women had been told since childhood that their bodies attracted danger, both spiritual and physical. Inserting garlic became a way of protecting themselves, not from infection, but from unseen evils. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like placing a burning chemical against the skin and calling the pain a blessing. They performed the ritual at night, often after prayers. The house would be quiet, the fire low, the air thick with the smell of herbs from earlier rituals. They moved slowly, with a kind of reverence, as though preparing for confession. Some believed the garlic purified the body after sex, others that it restored purity lost to sin. The pain that followed was considered penance. To them, the body was not something to protect, but to discipline. Cleanliness required endurance, and endurance was holy. Mothers taught their daughters about garlic the same way they taught them about washing with ash or bathing in smoke. It was part of their inheritance. The knowledge of survival passed down through fear. They explained that garlic's strength came from its ability to burn, that it killed what could not be seen. Young women obeyed without question, their faith stronger than their doubt. When the pain became unbearable, they stayed silent, believing it to be the price of safety. The irony was cruel. The very act meant to protect them often made them sick. The burning oils caused sores, infections, and sometimes fever. Yet when these symptoms appeared, they believed it was the poison leaving their bodies. They didn't have the words or the tools to understand what was happening to them. What they had was ritual, and ritual made suffering feel sacred. I find it quietly devastating that something meant to save them only proved how deeply they had learned to accept harm as devotion. The scent of garlic filled their homes, clinging to hands, hair, and clothing. Men found it unpleasant, but few dared to question it. The ritual was seen as private, even holy. It became a mark of discipline among women, a way of showing commitment to purity. To refuse it was to risk being judged as careless or sinful. Their world offered no gentle methods, no safety, only choices between harm and shame. Over time, the ritual faded, replaced by new forms of cleansing no less painful, but easier to disguise. Yet its memory endured in the whispers of old women who told stories of their mothers' courage and endurance. They spoke of how garlic kept sickness and spirits away, how its scent was proof of strength. No one called it cruelty, they called it tradition. It was easier to believe that they had been protected than to face the truth of what they had endured. The ritual reveals something unspoken about the lives of women in that age. Their bodies were battlegrounds where superstition, fear, and duty collided. They lived in a world that demanded purity but gave them only pain to achieve it. Garlic, with its sharp burn and suffocating smell, became both their weapon and their wound. It stood as proof that they were willing to hurt themselves to remain good in the eyes of others and in the eyes of God. The image that remains is stark. Women crouched by the fire, the glow of embers flickering against the pale cloth in their hands, the air sharp with the smell of crushed garlic. Their faces are calm, almost peaceful, even as their eyes glisten with tears. They are not victims in their own minds, but guardians of their bodies, keeping watch through pain. The act itself vanished long ago, but the reasoning behind it lingers in quieter forms, the endless demand for purity, the silent acceptance of discomfort as proof of worth. The story of garlic is not only about hygiene, it is about faith twisted into suffering. It reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous beliefs are those that promise to save us. This memory of garlic and smoke marks the final chapter of their most secret rituals, a world where fear of impurity guided every breath. After the burning stopped and the scent faded, another form of discipline waited, one that appeared almost gentle but carried the same quiet cruelty beneath its fabric of modesty and control. In the quiet corners of candle-lit rooms, far from the eyes of men, medieval women performed another ritual of control, the careful plucking of their eyebrows. It was not done for vanity alone, but as a declaration of discipline, a small rebellion against chaos. The tool they used was a simple piece of metal, shaped like a U, or sometimes a V, hammered from bronze or copper and polished until it gleamed faintly in the dim light. It was light enough to hold between two fingers, yet sharp enough to make the skin sting. To own one was to possess a symbol of refinement, proof that even in a world that denied them comfort, they could still curate beauty with precision and pain. Before the ritual began, they often warmed the tool over a candle flame to soften the metal and kill whatever unseen dirt clung to it. Then, standing before a piece of polished bronze or a dark window that faintly mirrored their face, they leaned close and began to pull each strand of hair, one by one. The sound was almost inaudible, just the faint pluck of hair from skin followed by a small hiss of breath. They worked slowly, sometimes for an hour, shaping their brows into thin, obedient lines. Each movement was deliberate, each wince was quiet. It is strangely funny how beauty, then as now, demanded more patience than pleasure. In wealthier households, ladies had servants assist with the task. One would hold the candle, another would tilt the mirror just so, while the mistress sat perfectly still, her expression tight with concentration. A single misplaced pull could ruin the symmetry she sought. Afterward, rose oil or vinegar water was dabbed gently across the brows to soothe the burning skin. The smell of metal and herbs mixed into something sharp and oddly clean. Beauty, for them, was not softness but endurance. Among poorer women, the ritual was rougher. They often made their tweezers from scraps of wire or thin plates of metal bent into shape. Some even used sharpened sticks of bone, pressing them together to pinch the hairs. Their hands were steady from years of labour, and though the tool was crude, the result was the same: a cleaner brow, a tidier face. They believed that a woman's appearance reflected her household. A neat brow meant control, just as a swept floor meant dignity. The removal of facial hair was also tied to morality. Thick brows were associated with lust and unruliness, while thin, arched ones signalled restraint. To pluck the face was to discipline it, to shape not only how others saw them but how they saw themselves. The act became habitual, something done in silence before prayers or gatherings, part of the daily preparation that kept their world in order. If one were to compare it to today, it would be like spending hours editing a photo just to make imperfections look natural. Yet beneath the calm repetition, there was pain. The metal pinched, the skin reddened, and sometimes it bled. Infection was common, but they did not stop. They covered the swelling with powder made from chalk or flour and continued. To them, pain was not a warning. It was proof of care. The more the brow stung, the cleaner it must have looked. Over time, the skin around their eyes grew sensitive, darkened slightly from irritation, but the routine went on, a quiet cycle of harm disguised as pride. The same tool was also used to remove hair from the upper lip. Before religious festivals or ceremonies, women gathered to prepare together, sitting near the fire, their laughter mingling with the faint scent of metal. They plucked, dabbed, and powdered, whispering about neighbours and sins while their faces turned red from the ritual. It was an intimate moment, a kind of solidarity built through shared endurance. Beauty may have been a burden, but it was a burden they understood together. In noble households, tweezers were decorated with small engravings, flowers, vines, or even the initials of their owner. Some were attached to chains and worn at the waist like jewellery. The act of plucking became ceremonial. It showed control, wealth, and taste. But no matter how ornate the tool, the act itself never changed a small piece of metal, a flash of pain, and the quiet satisfaction of shaping one's face into what society approved. Over time, this tiny ritual became a rhythm of daily life. They performed it not only before feasts and weddings, but on ordinary mornings too, as if neatness could guard them from judgment. To neglect one's brows was seen as a sign of despair. To keep them neat meant that dignity was still intact. In this way, the bronze tweezers became more than an accessory. They were an anchor, a reminder that control could exist in even the smallest acts. There is something quietly powerful in how they found mastery in such a fragile ritual. Each pluck was an assertion of order in a world ruled by filth and fear. They could not command their fates, but they could command their faces. The sting of metal was their proof of control, and for a moment, that was enough. When the last hair was pulled and the skin still throbbed faintly, they looked at their reflection, not for beauty, but for confirmation that the ritual had worked. The face in the mirror was theirs, shaped by their own hand, neat and composed once again. The image lingers women in flickering candlelight, metal in hand, their brows drawn thin as their patience, their reflection wavering in bronze. Beauty, for them, was not indulgence but endurance, not vanity but duty. And as the pain subsided, another ritual of restraint awaited, one that moved from the face to the body, binding the flesh in tight fabric that promised purity but delivered only pressure and silence. Among the many quiet rituals of medieval women, few were as strange and disciplined as the wrapping of the chest with rough linen or animal hide. It was not done to enhance the body, but to restrain it, to keep it clean, covered, and under control. The fabric was cut in wide strips, thick and coarse, then wound tightly around the chest until the curves disappeared beneath the pressure. It was meant to protect the skin from rubbing against unwashed garments, but it also served another purpose: to keep a woman's shape modest, contained, invisible. In the dim rooms where they dressed each morning, the sound of fabric pulling tight was a sound of duty, not comfort. The cloth most often used was woven from flax, a material strong enough to endure washing but still rough against bare skin. The feeling was abrasive, sometimes leaving faint red marks across the ribs. Yet that discomfort was accepted, even welcomed. Cleanliness, to them, was not softness but struggle. They believed that the body, if left unrestrained, would become impure. The chestband became both shield and symbol, a quiet declaration of order against the chaos of flesh. It almost feels darkly ironic that the same women who lacked clean water still wrap themselves daily in the illusion of hygiene. Before wearing it, many soaked the cloth in oils made from herbs like sage, rosemary, or lavender. The scent was strong, meant to cover the stale smell of sweat and wool. The oil also softened the fibres slightly, though it left a sticky sheen on the skin. When the fabric was pressed tight, the oils warmed under the body's heat, releasing their fragrance slowly throughout the day. To them, this was purity, the body sealed beneath scent and discipline. In noble households, the chestband was crafted with care. Some were made of finely woven linen embroidered with small patterns at the edge, hidden beneath layers of dress but known to the wearer. A few women even used softened leather, believing it blocked dirt and odour better than cloth. Servants helped them wrap it each morning, pulling the fabric firm and straight, smoothing wrinkles as if arranging armour. Once in place, it was rarely adjusted. The tightness gave a sense of security, the pressure a reminder that control must always be maintained. For poorer women, the practice was simpler, but no less meaningful. They used old fabric scraps, sometimes pieces of blankets cut into strips. Without oils or perfume, they relied on the binding itself to keep their bodies from touching the same clothes they wore every day. The chestband became a barrier between them and the dirt of their labour. After work, they hung it near the hearth to dry, the faint smell of smoke mixing with the sour scent of sweat. When the cloth stiffened overnight, they wore it again the next day without question. The act of wrapping the chest carried layers of unspoken belief. It was tied to modesty, but also to fear of decay, of impurity, of being seen as less disciplined. A clean woman, they thought, did not smell of flowers but one who kept her body contained. The binding prevented movement, restricted breath, and flattened softness. But it also gave a strange sense of calm. They stood straighter, felt firmer, and believed themselves safer within their wrappings. If compared to today, it would be like wearing a garment so tight it bruised the ribs, and still calling it comfort because it promised control. Sometimes, women treated the fabric with vinegar or salt water before wearing it, thinking this would kill unseen sickness. The damp cloth clung cold against the chest at first, then warmed as the day passed. The salt left a faint crust on the skin that scratched when they moved, but such small pain became part of the rhythm of being clean. They spoke little of it. Everyone did the same. In silence, they shared the same discomfort, the same faith in ritual. There were also superstitions around the act. It was said that a properly tied chestband could prevent illness from entering through the pores or protect the heart from evil thoughts. Mothers taught their daughters to tie it carefully, neither too tight nor too loose, and to replace it every few days. Some kept the old clothes and burned them with herbs, believing that doing so released bad energy gathered from the body. The smoke that rose from these small fires carried the scent of oil, ash, and something human, a reminder that cleanliness was never truly separate from suffering. Even when the chest ached and the skin beneath turned tender, they continued. Habit had replaced comfort long ago. To remove the band for too long was to risk impurity, and impurity meant shame. The daily act of wrapping became as natural as breathing, a quiet repetition that defined womanhood as much as childbirth or prayer. I find something deeply sad yet fascinating in how they equated pressure with purity, as if the body had to be silenced to stay clean. It shows how much of their world was built on endurance, how every ritual blurred the line between care and control. The chestband did not just hold the body, It held the belief that suffering was order. By evening, when the band was finally unwrapped, the relief came slowly. The skin tingled, marked with red lines where the fabric had pressed all day. Some rubbed oil or vinegar on the area. Others simply lay still, breathing deeply for the first time in hours. The air against bare skin felt almost sinful in its softness. Then, before sleep, they folded the fabric neatly, ready to bind themselves again at dawn. The image left behind is quiet but haunting. Women tightening fabric across their chests in silence. Their faces calm, their movements practiced. It was not beauty they sought, nor comfort, but control over a world that offered little else. The body was made clean by confinement, the mind soothed by repetition. And yet beneath those layers of cloth and oil, something fragile always trembled, waiting to breathe freely again. When morning came, the ritual would repeat, and the cycle of control would begin anew. But just beyond that stillness lay another practice, one even stranger, a final attempt to purify the body from within, using a method that blurred the line between faith and madness. Among all the strange rituals medieval women practiced to keep their bodies pure, none was more shocking, more quietly horrifying than the one they kept secret even from one another. The drinking of vinegar mixed with their own urine. It was believed to cleanse the body from within, to strip away every trace of odour, impurity, and sin. They called it purification of the organs, a private ritual of endurance that blurred the boundary between medicine and punishment. In the soft grey of dawn, when the world was still silent, they collected the first stream of urine, the so-called pure water, because they thought the body expelled its dirt during sleep. To this, they added a few spoonfuls of sour vinegar, stirred it with trembling hands, and lifted it to their lips. The liquid was warm, sharp, and bitter beyond words. It was swallowed in silence, with the same solemn faith that others reserve for prayer. The act was not madness to them. It was logic born of ignorance. In an age where the scent of the body was seen as a reflection of the soul, the idea of washing oneself from the inside made sense. They had been taught that odour was the mark of decay, and decay was the mark of sin. A clean woman smelled of nothing, not sweat, not flesh, not life. The thought that the body could betray them through smell haunted their every waking hour. It is strangely tragic that they feared their natural scent more than the poisons they consumed to erase it. The preparation was as ritualistic as any prayer. They used small clay cups or glass vials, often kept hidden in cupboards or beneath beds. The first urine of the day was considered most powerful, believed to carry the essence of health itself. The vinegar was added not only to disguise the taste but to activate the cleansing. Together, it formed what they called a living tonic, one that burned the throat, turned the stomach, yet was drunk with reverence. Some women recited short blessings as they drank, asking for the expulsion of impurity. Others kept their eyes closed, swallowing quickly before the bitterness could rise. In wealthier homes, this strange drink became part of the morning routine. Servants were instructed to prepare the mixture, and women consumed it discreetly before breakfast. Doctors of the time even encouraged the practice, claiming that the acidity opened the body's channels and removed stagnation. Housewives and noblewomen alike believed it prevented sickness and kept the skin fair. To them, the burn in their throats was not pain but progress. The sourness was proof that the body was being scoured clean. If compared to modern times, it would be like swallowing bleach and calling it self-care. But the effects were cruel. The mixture eroded the lining of their stomachs, causing nausea, cramps, and fainting. Some suffered ulcers that never healed. Still, the ritual persisted, spreading from one town to another like a rumour. The church did not condemn it, for it was tied to modesty and restraint, virtues praised more than health. Women whispered about it in private, passing recipes as if they were sacred secrets. Vinegar from apples was favoured for its softness. while wine vinegar was reserved for the wealthy. A few added herbs to dull the flavour, though nothing could truly disguise it. They believed that by cleansing themselves from within, they could silence the scent of their bodies. For them, smell was shame. To reek of sweat or decay meant failure, impurity, even moral weakness. So they drank bitterness in hope of becoming untouchable, scentless, and safe from judgment. Their bodies became battlegrounds between pride and pain, between cleanliness and survival. I can't help but feel a quiet sorrow imagining women punishing themselves for simply being alive. The mornings after such rituals were always quiet. The air in their rooms carried the faint sting of vinegar, a smell that clung to walls and linens. They moved slowly through their chores, pale and dizzy but composed. If anyone asked, they called it tonic for the stomach. No one questioned it. Everyone believed that to suffer for purity was noble. The body was not something to be trusted. It was something to be conquered. In time, the ritual spread beyond the walls of homes into monasteries and even royal courts. There were whispers that certain queens swore by it, convinced that it kept their skin white and their breath clean. Physicians wrote small notes praising the mixture's drying properties, using words that cloaked cruelty in the illusion of science. And so, through parchment and prayer, the practice became habit, habit became virtue, and virtue became poison. The irony of it all is that the women who drank this foul tonic were not unwise. They were desperate. Desperate to meet the world's impossible standards, desperate to scrub away what nature had given them. They had been told that holiness smelled like nothing, that a good woman must leave no trace of herself. They obeyed, faithfully, even when obedience hurt. And though the centuries have changed the tools and names, the urge remains hauntingly familiar, the endless wish to be pure by making oneself small. As evening fell, they often lit candles and whispered small prayers of thanks that their bodies had endured another day of discipline. Some mixed vinegar into their baths, letting its sting bite at their skin. Others rubbed it into their hands and hair, thinking it would carry the cleansing further. It was a devotion not to beauty, but to invisibility, to becoming untouchable by scent, sin, or softness. Their legacy lingers in quiet corners of history. The tools, the tinctures, the strange remedies, each was a fragment of a larger truth. For medieval women, hygiene was never about comfort. It was about survival within boundaries drawn by fear. They scrubbed, burned, plucked, wrapped, and drank in pursuit of an impossible standard. Their every act of cleanliness was an act of submission dressed as care. And yet, there is something undeniably human in their persistence. Through pain and ignorance, they sought control. However small, they refused to surrender to decay, even when their methods betrayed them. That fragile defiance, hidden beneath centuries of silence, is what makes their story unforgettable. So when we look back on their rituals, the ash, the vinegar, the smoke, the herbs, and the bitter cups they drank, we do not see savagery, but longing. A longing to be clean, to be seen as worthy, to be safe in a world that punished the body simply for being female. Their cleanliness was not vanity. It was hope, wrapped in pain and swallowed with faith. The candles have long gone out, and the tools are buried under dust, but their story remains. It whispers of strength, mistaken for sin, and of women who tried to purify themselves until there was nothing left to wash away. As this journey through medieval hygiene ends, let the silence of their rituals settle over you like the dim light of a dying fire. The world they lived in was cruel, but their endurance was extraordinary. May their story remind us how easily suffering can masquerade as virtue, and how fragile the line between purity and pain truly is. Now, close your eyes, leave behind the echo of their rituals, the scent of herbs and vinegar, and the heavy quiet of their rooms. Drift into a calm where no one must hurt to be clean. No one must burn to feel pure. Sleep peacefully tonight, far from their world of silent suffering. Good night.